The Carpathian Basin has been a crossroads of human life for thousands of years. Its fertile plains and river systems attracting continuous settlement since the Neolithic age. The earliest known populations were Indo-European groups, who left their mark not only through their presence, but through the names they gave to the landscape itself. The Carpathian Mountains, the Danube, and rivers such as the Tisa, Maros, Kuros, and Drava all carry echoes of these early inhabitants. Over time, new cultures arrived and blended into this landscape. During the Bronze Age, Illyrian communities settled in Transdanubia, and in the Iron Age, Celtic groups expanded into the region, bringing new social structures and technologies. Meanwhile, the vast Great Plain became the domain of mounted nomadic peoples from the east. From as early as the 7th century before Christ, Iranian-speaking groups such as the Scythians, Sarmatians, and later the Alans roamed these lands, finding in the basin one of the last environments where a steppe-based way of life could continue without major disruption. To the east, in the region later known as Transylvania, rich natural resources shaped a different kind of society. Abundant salt deposits and gold reserves supported the rise of the Dacians, an Indo-European people likely connected to the Thracian world. Further north, in the valleys and plains of present-day Slovakia, Germanic tribes established themselves, including the Markomans and Quads, whose clashes with the Roman Empire became part of imperial history. These groups left traces not only in written accounts, but in the landscape itself, preserved in place names that survived long after their departure. A new phase began when the Roman Empire expanded into the region. Under the rule of Augustus, Transdanubia was incorporated into the province of Pannonia, while the Dacian kingdom fell to Trajan in the early 2nd century. Roman administration reshaped the land, introducing urban centres, military infrastructure, and agricultural estates. Cities flourished, and the standard of living rose significantly, as seen in settlements such as Aquincum, which developed into a major urban centre along the Danube. The frontier of the empire was marked by a chain of fortifications, watchtowers, and military camps forming a defensive system that stretched across the region. Yet this stability did not last forever. In Dacia, Roman authority came to an end after less than 2 centuries, when increasing pressure from external groups forced the empire to withdraw. Pannonia endured longer under Roman control, but by the 3rd century, repeated invasions began to erode its cities and infrastructure. The collapse of Roman influence opened the door to new waves of migration and conflict. Among the most formidable of these newcomers were the Huns, a powerful nomadic confederation that swept into the basin in the 5th century. Under the leadership of Attila, they transformed the region into the centre of a vast but short-lived empire. From this base, they launched campaigns deep into the territories of both the Eastern and Western Roman empires. Their presence was intense but brief. After Attila's death, internal divisions and external pressures led to the rapid disintegration of their power. Despite this, their legacy endured, especially in later traditions, that attempted to link them with the origins of other peoples in the region. Following the fall of the Huns, Germanic tribes moved into the vacuum they left behind. The Gepids established control over territories east of the Tisa, while the Langobards occupied parts of Transdanubia before eventually moving south into Italy. Soon after, another steppe power arrived. The Avars entered the Carpathian Basin in the late 6th century, overpowering existing groups and establishing their own dominance. Like earlier nomadic societies, they relied on mobility, livestock, and raiding. For a time, they posed a serious threat to neighbouring empires, even taking part in a major assault on Constantinople, alongside Eastern allies. Over the centuries, however, their power gradually weakened. Military defeats and internal changes transformed their society, leading them to to adopt a more settled way of life. Archaeological evidence reveals that the Avar period was far from static. Around the beginning of the 8th century, a noticeable shift appears in burial practices and material culture, suggesting the arrival of new groups into the basin. These later communities, often associated with the onagurs, represent a complex mixture of peoples linked to the broader steppe world. At the same time, Slavic populations began to spread into the region, especially along its fringes. Their presence is visible both in early written records and in the enduring legacy of place names, which reflect a deep and lasting influence on the cultural landscape. By the 9th century, the Carpathian Basin had become a contested frontier shaped by several competing powers. To the west, the Carolingian Empire extended its authority into former Roman territories, governing through local leaders and military officials. To the north, a Slavic polity emerged, striving to maintain independence while navigating pressure from its powerful neighbours. In the south and southeast, the Bulgarian state expanded its reach, controlling large parts of the Balkans and projecting influence into the basin itself. These overlapping spheres of control created a dynamic and often unstable political environment. During this period, another transformation was underway. Christianity began to spread once again across the region, carried by missionaries and supported by competing centres of religious authority. Western areas aligned with Latin traditions, while eastern regions came under the influence of Orthodox Christianity. This religious division reflected broader political rivalries and shaped the cultural development of the region for centuries to come. Despite these layers of history, a long-standing question remains unresolved. Traditional interpretations suggest that, by the late 9th century, much of the central basin was sparsely populated, awaiting the arrival of new groups who would reshape its identity. Yet this view raises serious doubts. The rapid emergence of organised settlements in the following century suggests that earlier populations must have remained in place, maintaining continuity beneath the surface of historical silence. Archaeological findings support this possibility, pointing to a degree of coexistence between older communities and incoming groups. The first scattered notices about the Hungarians appear in records from the 9th century, but for much of that time they remained distant and little understood by the Christian world. Only toward the end of the century did their name begin to inspire widespread fear when they entered the Carpathian Basin and from there launched a series of destructive campaigns into Western Europe. Before that turning point, they stood at the edge of written history, seen only in passing by neighbouring civilizations that observed them from afar. The early Hungarians left behind almost no written testimony of their own. It is possible that they knew a runic script influenced by Turkic traditions, yet no native narrative survives from their pagan age. Everything known about them must therefore be assembled from the accounts of outsiders. Some of the earliest fuller descriptions came from Muslim travellers and merchants who encountered them in the late 9th century and reported on their lands, customs, and power. Their observations were later absorbed into Eastern geographical traditions. After the Hungarians settled in the Carpathian Basin, those Eastern accounts became rarer, while Byzantine and Western writers began to describe them more often. Byzantine emperors and chroniclers focused especially on their style of warfare, their political structure, and their recent past. Western annals, saints' lives, and local narratives, written in response to the sudden shock of their invasions, also preserved important details about their behaviour and appearance. Later, Hungarian tradition added its own fragments, though these were shaped by memory, legend, and political imagination. Because written evidence is so uneven, archaeology has played a central role in reconstructing the world of the 10th century Hungarians. Over many decades, excavations have uncovered a rich material record that has greatly deepened understanding of their society after their arrival in the basin. Yet traces of Hungarian life before that settlement remain scarce in the territories east of the Carpathians. Linguistics has been equally important. Old place names, especially the most archaic forms, offer clues about settlement, social structure, and ethnic presence. Used carefully, such names help trace the geography of early Hungary, though they can also mislead when pushed too far. Taken together, archaeology and language provide a framework for understanding a people whose own voice is largely missing from the historical record. Although the first secure references to the Hungarians belong to the 9th century, the people themselves were far older. Their language belongs to the Ugric branch of the Finno-Ugric family. Its most distant surviving relatives were spoken far to the northeast, in the forests and riverlands of Siberia by small communities, whose way of life was based on fishing and hunting. Even so, the connection is not obvious to a casual observer. Hungarian had long since developed along a separate path and had been shaped by a very different environment. Over many centuries, the ancestors of the Hungarians had moved far from the original Finno-Ugric world and adapted to life on the Eurasian steppe. Their own name for themselves was Magyar, a very old word already visible in Eastern sources during the 9th century. The name by which they became known across Europe had a different origin. It derived from the Turkic term onagur, a name that had once referred to a tribal union. Byzantine writers often called the Hungarians Turks, using a broad label shaped more by lifestyle than by exact ethnicity. Western writers, seeing mounted raiders from the east, often described them as Huns or Avars, because these were the steppe peoples most familiar from older memory. Later, Byzantine authors, influenced by classical language and literary fashion, could even call them Scythians or Pannonians. These names reveal less about true origin than about how other societies tried to fit the Hungarians into known patterns. Long before they appeared in the sources, the Hungarians had broken away from the wider Finno-Ugric world, probably in the first millennium before Christ. For centuries afterward, they moved across the steppe, in close contact with Iranian and later Turkic peoples. Through all those migrations, their language kept its essential structure and preserved its deep roots. Its grammar and basic vocabulary continue to reflect its older heritage, even while new layers of influence entered from outside. By the time they emerged into clearer history, the Hungarians no longer resembled their remote northern linguistic relatives in culture or way of life. They had become a mounted people of the steppe, shaped by the same military habits and social realities that marked the nomadic world around them. The strongest outside influence seems to have come from Turkic-speaking groups, especially the onagurs. This influence reached deep into language and daily life. Hungarian preserves hundreds of words of Turkic origin, evidence of long and intense contact. These borrowed terms point not only to vocabulary exchange, but to the adoption of habits, institutions, and practical knowledge. The old Iranian peoples of the steppe, such as the Scythians and Sarmatians, almost certainly also left an imprint, though this is far harder to trace with confidence. Some scholars have tried to identify Iranian loanwords and cultural influences, especially from the Alans, but the results are much less substantial than those connected with Turkic contact. That imbalance suggests that the Turkic connection was especially important in the making of early Hungarian society. The first historical glimpses of the Hungarians place them in the wider zone north of the Black Sea. Byzantine evidence links them with the Bulgarians during the reign of Emperor Theophilus. Other traditions place encounters with them near the Crimea and along the lower Danube. Eastern descriptions suggest that by the late 9th century, their territory stretched between the lands of the Bulgarians, the Khazars, and the Pechenegs, somewhere between the great rivers of the steppe. The Hungarians themselves later remembered this earlier homeland by a name meaning the land near the Attil. Their power extended into the forest margins of the north, where they raided Slavic populations, living beyond the open grasslands. In this world of rivers, pastures, forest edges, and shifting frontiers, they lived before their westward move transformed the history of Central Europe. The first Western notice of the Hungarians dates from the early 860s, when they attacked East Frankish lands and were described as an enemy previously unknown. A few decades later, they appear again in Western politics, first as allies of Moravia, and then as partners of the Frankish king Arnulf against Moravia. From the 890s onward, events moved quickly. The occupation of the Carpathian Basin began in the middle of a larger struggle involving Bulgaria, Byzantium, Moravia, and the Eastern Franks. What later generations remembered as a single dramatic conquest was in reality a more complex and uneven process. Later, Hungarian tradition tried to turn this movement into a heroic national story. A medieval writer composed a vivid narrative in which the entry into the basin became a chain of victories over local rulers, one after another. Yet that account was written centuries after the event and reflects imagination far more than reliable memory. The enemies it describes do not match the known political realities of the time. In many cases, the narrative seems to have been built by transforming place names into the names of defeated princes, and by weaving local legends into a grand story of triumph. It remains valuable as a reflection of later medieval thinking, but not as a straightforward guide to what actually happened. A more convincing interpretation sees the Hungarian takeover in two stages. First came military expansion into the Great Plain and Transylvania during a period of conflict among the surrounding powers. Then came the final abandonment of the earlier eastern homeland after a devastating attack from the Pechenegs. The initial advance appears to have been part of a broader war in which Byzantium and the Franks both sought Hungarian help against their rivals. While Bulgaria was attacking Byzantium and Moravia was pressuring Frankish lands, Hungarian forces struck from the rear. They defeated the Bulgarians in one theatre and helped undermine Moravian power in another. These victories opened the way for them to establish themselves across major parts of the Carpathian Basin. But the move west was not driven by victory alone. Soon after these campaigns, a violent upheaval on the steppe changed everything. The Pechenegs, themselves pushed westward by pressure from farther east, burst into the lands occupied by the Hungarians. At the same moment, Bulgaria seized the chance to attack. Caught between enemies, the Hungarians suffered a double blow. Their old homeland collapsed, and the survivors withdrew into the Carpathian Basin. The terror of that destruction left a deep mark on Hungarian memory. What haunted later tradition was not simply war with Bulgaria, but the trauma of the Eastern assault that shattered their former world. The occupation of the basin was not completed at once. Western Pannonia remained under Frankish rule for a few more years, protected by the alliance between the Hungarians and Arnulf. Only after his death did those lands fall under Hungarian control. What remained of Moravian power was destroyed not long afterward. Once established in their new base, the Hungarians began the long series of Western raids that made them famous and feared across Europe. Italy was among the first regions to experience this new threat directly. Hungarian forces entered as allies in local political struggles, defeated their enemies, and soon discovered how vulnerable the wealthier lands of the West could be. When Italian rulers agreed to pay tribute, the raiders turned elsewhere. Germany, then politically fragmented and often divided by internal rivalries, offered repeated opportunities. Over the following decades, Hungarian armies struck Bavaria, Swabia, Franconia, Saxony, Lorraine, Burgundy, and beyond. At times they reached the Atlantic coast. At other moments they swept south through the Alps into the Italian peninsula. Their campaigns were flexible, fast and unpredictable, crossing immense distances and exploiting every weakness in the political map of the age. Not every year brought a new invasion, and the surviving records often repeat the same events under different dates. Even so, the overall pattern is clear. For a long period, Western Europe had no reliable answer to Hungarian warfare. Some rulers tried to buy peace. Others attempted military resistance and were defeated. Great church centres and rich towns suffered badly. Monasteries were burned, cities plundered, and wide regions left in fear of sudden attack. Only gradually did the Western kingdoms begin to adapt. The turning point came with the rise of the Saxon rulers in Germany. Henry the Fowler first secured a temporary peace, using the respite to strengthen defences and prepare for the next attack. When the Hungarians returned, he defeated them in battle, showing that they were not invincible. His son Otto expanded that work, bringing more of Germany under tighter royal control and narrowing the range in which the raiders could move freely. Even so, Hungarian attacks continued for some time, sometimes taking advantage of rebellions within the German kingdom itself. The last great Western expedition ended in disaster. In the summer of 955, a major Hungarian army advanced into Germany. But near Augsburg, Otto confronted it and won a decisive victory. That defeat ended the age of large-scale Hungarian raids into the west. It also left a powerful scar on Hungarian memory. Stories grew around the few who escaped and around the leaders who were captured and executed. Their deaths were remembered not only as political losses but as spiritual humiliation, according to pagan belief, because execution at enemy hands carried meaning beyond the battlefield. The battle marked more than a military defeat. It forced a reorientation in Hungarian history. Raiding did not vanish overnight in every direction. Hungarian attacks against neighbouring Slavic lands had long been part of steppe politics, though these are less clearly recorded. Campaigns against Byzantium are somewhat better documented. Even there, however, imperial diplomacy often managed to contain the danger through negotiation, bribery, or calculated concessions. After the middle of the 10th century, as Byzantine strength revived and Hungarian power changed in character, even these expeditions faded. By the end of the century, the age of plundering warfare was drawing to a close. Contemporary observers almost all describe the Hungarians as mounted nomads, similar in their habits to earlier steppe peoples. They were seen as masters of horseback warfare, men who lived, travelled, fought, and rested in the saddle. Their military equipment reflected that way of life. They carried bows, sabres, and spears, wore protective leather armour, and relied on large numbers of horses. Their tactics were built on speed, distance, deception, and coordination. A favourite method was the feigned retreat, drawing the enemy forward in pursuit before turning back suddenly, while hidden forces attacked from another direction. Their skill with the bow, especially on horseback, gave them a deadly advantage over slower opponents. The terror they inspired did not come only from military efficiency. Foreign descriptions repeatedly stress the scale of destruction left behind them. Villages and towns were burned, adults were slaughtered, and captives were taken mainly among women and children. To Western writers, the Hungarians represented not ordinary warfare, but a more absolute kind of devastation, one that seemed aimed at breaking the very life of a region. That impression may have been sharpened by fear, but there is little reason to think it was wholly invented. Later centuries would teach the Hungarians themselves what such invasions could mean, when new nomadic powers descended on their own lands. Archaeology provides a vivid picture of the warrior world that supported these campaigns. Roughly 1,000 graves have been identified that belong to mounted fighters and their families. They are marked by weapons, ornaments, horse burials, and symbolic horse equipment. Some graves contain rich objects of gold or silver and must have belonged to people of princely rank. Others, still impressive but less lavish, reveal the existence of a broader warrior elite. The silver-decorated sabre tache appears repeatedly as a sign of status, though its exact symbolic value remains uncertain. These burials suggest a society in which high-ranking figures lived in separate residences, surrounded by their herds, followers, and dependents. Beneath this elite stood a larger stratum of armed men who may be thought of as a warrior middle layer. Their graves often appear in clusters, smaller and less rich than princely burials, but still clearly connected to the military life of the age. Coins found in some of these graves, many from Western Europe and especially Italy, show how closely the wealth of Hungarian society was tied to raiding, tribute, and long-distance contact. Eastern silver coins also appear, likely entering not as plunder, but through trade. Yet the Hungarians of the 10th century were not all mounted raiders. The vast majority of graves from the period belonged to poorer people, buried without weapons or luxury items. These cemeteries often contain hundreds of commoners alongside only a few distinguished men. Their material culture points to settled village life rather than mobile warfare. In some cases, the villages connected to these cemeteries have even been located nearby. For a long time, scholars assumed these poor rural populations must have been non-Hungarian subjects, especially Slavs, because they did not fit the image of the conqueror. But the later linguistic map of these same regions suggests that many of them were, in fact, Hungarian-speaking. More likely, the countryside contained a mixed population in which Hungarians, Slavs, and others lived together while sharing similar local conditions. Pagan Hungarian society, therefore, seems to have had three broad layers. At the top stood a narrow elite of noble families. Beneath them was a warrior class that carried out military campaigns and helped enforce power. At the base stood the common people, many of them peasants who worked the land and supported the upper strata. Eastern descriptions of richly dressed Hungarians with silver and gold weapons probably refer to the leading ranks of society. Those who moved with flocks and tents while also controlling farmland were likely nobles and warriors. The labour of cultivation was probably carried out by dependent rural populations, settled in permanent communities. Language strongly supports this picture of a mixed economy. Hungarian preserves many old loanwords, from Turkic connected with stock breeding, dairy production, and animal husbandry, exactly what would be expected in a people shaped by the steppe. But it also contains equally early terms for ploughing, sowing, harvesting, grain processing, viticulture, and horticulture. These words point unmistakably to agriculture and permanent settlement. The ancient Hungarians were not simply nomads, wandering without fixed routes. By the time they entered the Carpathian Basin, their society already combined pastoral traditions with cultivated land and settled rural life. The political structure of this pagan world is harder to reconstruct. The evidence is sparse and often contradictory. Eastern reports from the 9th century describe a dual leadership, with two rulers sharing authority. One figure held higher ceremonial rank, while the other exercised effective power, especially in war and practical affairs. This arrangement is often compared to that of the Khazars, who had a similarly divided system. Some scholars have therefore imagined a sacred ruler standing above a more active military leader. At the time of the conquest, traces of such a dual system may still have existed. Contemporary and near-contemporary sources refer to leaders, whose identities and offices remain uncertain. Later tradition preserved some names, but not in a clear or consistent way. One branch of Hungarian memory placed Almos at the head of the people before the conquest, and Arpad as the great leader who guided the entry into the Carpathian Basin. Another body of evidence, especially from Byzantine testimony, suggests a more complicated order in which Arpad was selected as principal ruler before the conquest, while other leading figures retained their own authority. Arpad himself stands at the centre of Hungarian dynastic memory. Later, chronicles traced his ancestry back through Almos and surrounded the family with mythic elements, including stories of supernatural birth and sacred signs. These tales reveal how the ruling house was understood in later centuries, even if they say little with certainty about the original political system. What matters most is that the dynasty, later known as the House of Arpad, came to embody continuity, legitimacy, and princely rule. Byzantine evidence from the middle of the 10th century suggests that the Grand Prince was not an all-powerful monarch. Alongside him stood other great dignitaries, including the Gula and another powerful office holder. Each of the major tribal groupings also had its own chief. This points to a political system based less on centralized monarchy than on negotiated leadership among several powerful lineages. Military campaigns, including the Western raids, seem often to have been led by autonomous chiefs, rather than directed from a single unquestioned centre. Only after the defeats of the mid-10th century, especially after 955, does it appear that local powers were gradually brought under firmer control, making possible the stronger unity from which the later kingdom would emerge. The tribal structure of early Hungarian society is known above all from Byzantine testimony, which speaks of 7 tribes forming the Magyar people. There is good reason to trust this information because it fits later memory and is strongly reinforced by place names. The old expression meaning 7 Magyars seems to preserve the memory of this tribal union. The names of the tribes also survived in many settlements across the Carpathian Basin. These names are scattered widely rather than concentrated in neat blocks, and this pattern is highly significant. It suggests that the tribes of the 10th century were not separate ethnic communities, occupying clearly bounded territories. The kingdom that later developed in Hungary appears, by early medieval standards, remarkably uniform in language, law, and material culture across a broad area. Efforts to assign each tribe to a fixed province have not produced convincing results. The scattered place names instead point toward a people that had already become deeply integrated before or during the conquest. The tribal framework still existed, but it no longer worked as a map of distinct ethnic homelands. Another important element in the formation of the Hungarians was the joining of the Kavar groups. Byzantine accounts describe them as 3 tribes that had once belonged to the Khazar world, and later attached themselves to the Magyars after internal conflict. A Western source confirms the existence of a similar name in connection with Hungarian activity. The Kavars were almost certainly of Turkic origin, and the emperor was told that they and the Hungarians had once spoken different languages. Yet the linguistic and archaeological record of the Carpathian Basin does not support the survival of a separate Turkic-speaking Kavar population in the 10th century. No clearly distinct Kavar material culture can be isolated there, and Hungarian itself does not preserve signs of prolonged bilingual coexistence inside the basin. The most likely conclusion is that the Kavars had merged with the Magyars before the conquest, or long before the 10th century had advanced very far. By then, they no longer formed a separate people in any practical sense. What survived was the memory of their union. That memory may have mattered because it explained how the Hungarian people had once been formed out of more than one component. In this light, the old connection between the name, Onagur, and a 10-tribe federation takes on special meaning. If 7 Magyar tribes joined with 3 Kavar tribes, then the political and ethnic structure remembered in later names begins to make historical sense. The people who entered the Carpathian Basin were not a simple, isolated tribe arriving untouched from the east, but the product of a long process of fusion, movement, and adaptation on the steppe. The early footprint of the Hungarian conquerors can still be traced across the Carpathian Basin through 2 powerful clues. burial sites of mounted warriors, and the enduring memory of tribal names preserved in place names. When these elements are placed together, they outline a clearly defined zone of settlement. This territory covered the central basin, stretching across its plains and rolling hills, enclosed by the natural barrier of surrounding mountain ranges. It was here that the Hungarians established their core domain during the early 10th century, shaping a landscape that would remain central to their identity for generations. Within this region, the map reveals something even more complex. Alongside Hungarian settlements, numerous place names point to the presence of other ethnic groups. Some of these names preserve memories reaching far beyond the basin itself. Settlements like Varsani echo the ancient Iranian name of the Alans, while others, such as Ozolar, reflect a Turkic version of the same people. Names connected to distant regions of Central Asia also appear, hinting at the movement or influence of groups linked to the Khwarezmian world. Villages bearing names like Varkani recall the early Avars, while others preserve the memory of Bulgar groups through names derived from older Turkic forms. Still more place names suggest the scattered presence of Pecheneg communities, marking the traces of yet another nomadic people who once moved across these lands. Together, these names reveal a mosaic of populations, each leaving its mark on the geography. The memory of individuals also survived in the landscape. Certain place names are linked to figures known from early Hungarian history, suggesting that the names of rulers and notable leaders became attached to settlements over time. Locations bearing the names of Arpad, Taxony, Faj, Bulcu, or Lel appear in different parts of the basin, especially along key routes and river systems. Some historians have proposed that these names might indicate seasonal centres of power, places where leaders moved between summer and winter quarters as part of a still partially mobile way of life. Others reject this idea, arguing that such interpretations go beyond what the evidence can safely support. What remains clear is that memory, authority, and geography became closely intertwined. The arrival of the Hungarians also brought them into direct contact with existing populations, especially Slavic communities. Many Slavs came under Hungarian rule during the conquest, and their presence is clearly visible in place names that predate Hungarian settlement. In some regions, particularly in Transdanubia, these older Slavic names appear embedded within later Hungarian landscapes, suggesting that the population was already established when the newcomers arrived. Over time, these communities became part of the evolving society of the basin, contributing to its cultural and linguistic diversity. Transylvania stands out as a region with its own distinct character. Its very name reflects a geographical concept describing a land beyond the forest. From the beginning, it appears to have been treated as a separate zone within the broader Hungarian world. Archaeological evidence confirms that Hungarian warriors were present there during the 10th century, yet the pattern of place names tells a different story. Unlike the central basin, Transylvania shows a striking absence of tribal names, while at the same time preserving a strong layer of Slavic place names. Even major rivers and settlements bear names of Slavic origin, suggesting that this cultural influence was deeply rooted. These differences point toward a unique political situation. During the 10th century, Transylvania was not directly ruled by the main line of Hungarian rulers descending from Arpad. Instead, it appears to have been governed by a separate line of leaders, known by the title Gyula. These rulers may have been connected to the earlier leadership structure of the Hungarians before their settlement in the basin. One such ruler established relations with the Byzantine Empire, receiving honours and converting to Christianity in Constantinople. His acceptance of the new faith was not merely symbolic. Religious figures sent from the empire worked to spread Christianity among the local population, gradually reshaping beliefs and practices. Even so, elements of older traditions remained visible, including the continued use of Turkic names within the ruling elite, suggesting that older cultural layers had not yet fully disappeared. This situation highlights the complexity of early Hungarian political organization. Power was not entirely centralized, and different regions could follow their own paths for a time. Transylvania, though connected to the wider Hungarian world, maintained a degree of autonomy that reflected older structures and external influences. While these regional differences were unfolding, a much larger transformation was taking shape across Europe. Around the turn of the first millennium, the boundaries of Christian civilization expanded rapidly. Regions that had long been considered part of the pagan world began to adopt Christianity and develop more stable political systems. This transformation did not occur in isolation. Across Northern and Eastern Europe, different peoples followed similar paths, moving from loosely organized societies towards structured kingdoms built around a new religious framework. In Hungary, this shift began under the rule of Gaza, descendant of Arpad. By his time, the political landscape had already changed significantly. Earlier patterns of shared leadership and competing powers had given way to a more concentrated form of authority. Gaza emerged as the dominant figure, and his rule marked the beginning of a deliberate effort to reshape Hungarian society. His methods were often harsh. Later accounts describe him as a ruler who used violence to eliminate rivals and secure his position. Whether exaggerated or not, these descriptions reflect a period of consolidation in which competing lines of power were brought under control. At the same time, Gaza turned outward, seeking stable relations with neighbouring powers, especially the Holy Roman Empire. Diplomatic contacts were established, alliances formed, and territorial claims adjusted in order to avoid conflict. These moves created a more secure environment in which internal transformation could proceed. Among the most important steps he took was the introduction of Christianity. With support from abroad, missionaries entered Hungary, and Gaza himself accepted baptism along with members of the elite. Yet his commitment to the new faith remained incomplete. He enforced conversion among his people and suppressed older practices. But he did not fully abandon the traditions of his ancestors. The result was a period of overlap in which old beliefs and new religious structures coexisted uneasily. The transformation reached its decisive phase under his son, who became known as Stephen. When Gaza died, Stephen inherited not only power, but a process that was still unfinished. His rule marked the transition from a loose tribal federation to a unified kingdom. His first challenge was to secure his authority against internal rivals. One of the most significant threats came from a relative who claimed leadership based on older traditions. Stephen defeated him in battle and took drastic measures to demonstrate that resistance would not be tolerated. These acts sent a clear message that a new order had begun. Stephen then turned to the wider question of legitimacy. To establish his position beyond dispute, he adopted the title of king and was crowned in a ceremony that symbolized the birth of a new political system. This act transformed Hungary into a recognized monarchy within the European world. The new title carried more than symbolic weight. It marked the beginning of a structured state built on Christian principles, supported by institutions that would endure long after his reign. The adoption of Christianity under Stephen went far beyond personal belief. It became the foundation for organizing the kingdom. Churches were established, clergy were appointed, and a network of religious authority spread across the land. Conversion was enforced where necessary, and resistance was met with firm measures. Yet the process was gradual. Old customs did not disappear overnight, and the transition required sustained effort over many years. Stephen also worked to bring all regions under his control. Transylvania, which had previously followed its own path, was incorporated into the kingdom, ending its separate political existence. Local rulers were replaced or subordinated, and new officials loyal to the king were appointed. This unification created a single political entity, where previously there had been overlapping zones of authority. Relations with external powers remained a constant concern. Stephen maintained close ties with the Holy Roman Empire, strengthened by family connections through marriage. At times, these relations led to cooperation, at other times, to conflict. Yet throughout his reign he succeeded in preserving the independence of his kingdom, balancing diplomacy and military action when necessary. Toward the end of his life, a new problem emerged. The question of succession became urgent after the death of his son, who had been intended to inherit the throne. Without a clear heir, the stability of the kingdom was at risk. Stephen chose a successor from outside the direct line, a decision that would later lead to conflict. Rival claims, internal divisions, and external interference soon followed. After his death, Hungary entered a period of uncertainty. Foreign influence grew stronger and internal struggles weakened the unity that had been so carefully built. Different rulers rose and fell, some supported by local nobles, others by outside powers. At times, the kingdom seemed close to losing its independence altogether. Amid these struggles, resistance also took a different form. Pagan traditions, suppressed but not entirely extinguished, resurfaced in violent uprisings. Clergy were attacked, churches destroyed, and efforts were made to restore older ways. Yet these movements ultimately failed. The Christian order, once established, proved resilient enough to survive even serious crises. The return of rulers from the Arpad line restored a measure of stability. Although conflicts continued, the basic structure created under Stephen endured. Over time, the kingdom regained its strength, and the institutions founded during this transformative period became firmly rooted. The transition from a world of nomadic traditions to a Christian monarchy had been turbulent and often brutal, but it reshaped Hungary in a lasting way, placing it firmly within the political and cultural framework of medieval Europe. Ladislaus I stands as one of the most powerful figures of early Hungarian history, often mentioned in the same breath as Stephen I of Hungary. Yet the brilliance of his reputation does not come from a well-documented record of achievements. In truth, the details of his life are no clearer than those of the first king. His lasting fame was shaped not by precise historical memory, but by the imagination of later generations. Over time, his image grew into something larger than life. While Stephen was remembered as a strict and devout ruler who built order and law, Ladislaus became the embodiment of youthful strength and heroic virtue. He was not only a king but a symbol, a warrior whose legend echoed across centuries. After his death, his popularity rose to extraordinary heights. He was honoured as a saint and became one of the most beloved figures in Hungarian religious tradition. Stories about him spread across the kingdom, appearing in painted church walls even in the most remote villages. Among these tales, one stood above all others. It told of a battle against a steppe warrior who had abducted a Hungarian girl. Ladislaus pursued him, defeated him in combat, and rescued the captive. This scene, repeated again and again in medieval art, turned him into the ideal warrior king. For the nobility and the military elite, he represented courage, honour, and strength. His image was not shaped by theological writings or legal reforms, but by the memory of action, bravery, and personal valour. When Ladislaus took the throne, the kingdom was still marked by internal conflict. One of his first concerns was dealing with his rival, Coloman. At first, he attempted reconciliation, persuading him to abandon his claims and return peacefully. But Coloman's continued plotting forced the king to imprison him. Eventually, Solomon was released and fled to the steppe frontier, where he sought support among nomadic groups. In a final attempt to regain power, he launched another campaign but failed. His life ended far from Hungary, lost in warfare beyond the borders of his former realm. Over time, his story also entered legend, and rumours even claimed that he survived as a wandering hermit. Ladislaus could show mercy, but he could also act with harsh determination when the stability of the kingdom was at stake. His reign was defined by efforts to strengthen and secure the system created earlier. Laws became stricter, punishments more severe, and authority more firmly enforced. At the same time, he strengthened the position of Christianity. He supported the elevation of earlier figures to sainthood, reinforcing the spiritual foundation of the kingdom. The memory of Stephen I of Hungary became central to this effort, representing continuity and legitimacy. His remains were ceremonially honoured, and relics associated with him became objects of deep veneration. One of Ladislaus's most important achievements came beyond Hungary's borders. He extended his influence southward into Croatia, marking the beginning of a new phase in Hungarian expansion. This neighbouring kingdom, situated between the mountains and the Adriatic coast, had its own traditions and political structures. Its ruler, who had secured his position with papal support, left no strong successor. Ladislaus used this opportunity to assert his claim and moved into the region with little resistance. Croatia was brought under his authority, though not absorbed entirely into Hungary. Instead, it remained a distinct kingdom, linked by the person of the ruler. This expansion also brought changes within the region known as Slavonia. Located between the rivers and mountains to the south, it became more closely integrated into the Hungarian political system. Its administration followed patterns similar to other frontier regions, maintaining certain local characteristics while acknowledging royal authority. A new bishopric was established, reinforcing both political control and religious influence. The region retained a unique status, shaped by its mixed population and earlier connections to surrounding lands. After Ladislaus, the crown passed to his nephew Coloman, a ruler very different in character. Unlike the heroic image associated with his predecessor, Coloman was known for his intellect. Contemporary descriptions portray him as physically unremarkable, even burdened by various infirmities, yet highly educated and capable. His abilities earned him the reputation of a learned king. However, his reign was far from peaceful. His brother, Almos, challenged him repeatedly, leading to years of tension and rebellion. At first, Coloman showed restraint, granting him authority over part of the realm, but repeated uprisings forced him to act decisively. Eventually, he ordered the blinding of Almos and his son, removing them permanently from the line of succession. During Coloman's reign, Hungary encountered one of the most dramatic movements of the medieval world. Waves of crusaders passed through the kingdom on their way to the eastern Mediterranean. Some travelled peacefully, maintaining discipline and respecting local authority. Others behaved more like unruly bands, threatening order and stability. Coloman managed this situation with firm control. He allowed organised groups to pass safely, even escorting them personally across parts of the country, while stopping and dispersing those who attempted to plunder. His handling of the situation prevented large-scale destruction and demonstrated the growing strength of royal authority. Coloman also completed the process of integrating Croatia into the Hungarian sphere. He defeated local rivals and was crowned there as king, establishing a lasting political connection. Croatia retained its own identity and institutions governed by local leaders, under the authority of the Hungarian crown. This arrangement allowed for stability without direct domination. The Croatian nobility continued to follow its own customs, and its obligations remained limited, especially in military service. Beyond Croatia lay Dalmatia, a region very different in character. Its coastal cities were part of a Mediterranean world, shaped by trade, maritime culture, and connections to the Byzantine sphere. These cities were largely autonomous and governed by their own elites. Coloman extended his authority there as well, but his control remained less secure. He secured recognition from these cities by respecting their privileges and allowing them to retain their autonomy, while ensuring their loyalty through economic arrangements. As Hungary expanded, its rulers began to redefine their authority. The title of the king changed, reflecting not just leadership over a people, but control over territories. The kingdom itself became a defined political entity, with clear boundaries and recognized domains. This shift marked an important step in the development of medieval statehood. Authority was no longer based solely on personal rule over a group, but on governance of land and institutions. During this period, Hungary moved from being a target of invasions to becoming an active regional power. Earlier threats from the west and east gradually diminished. The great nomadic raids ceased, and the kingdom gained enough strength to project influence beyond its borders. Expansion, whether through direct conquest or political influence, became a defining feature of Hungarian policy for centuries. At the heart of this transformation stood the Christian monarchy. The adoption of Christianity reshaped not only belief, but the entire structure of power. The king now ruled by divine authority supported by the church. This gave his position a legitimacy that earlier rulers had never possessed. At the same time, it placed new responsibilities upon him. He was expected to maintain order, uphold justice, and protect the faith. The balance between spiritual and political authority became a defining feature of the system. The foundations of this new order were expressed in teachings attributed to the first king, emphasizing the importance of moral rule, openness to foreign influence, and respect for tradition. These ideas reflected a kingdom still in formation, aware of its fragility and the need for stability. Foreign knights, priests, and administrators were encouraged to settle, bringing new knowledge and practices. At the same time, older customs were not entirely discarded, allowing continuity alongside change. The organization of government relied on a network of officials and fortified centers. Royal authority extended through local leaders who governed territories on behalf of the king. These regions formed the basis of administration, taxation, and defense. Over time, they evolved into the counties that would define Hungary's internal structure for centuries. Alongside these officials stood the church, whose leaders played a crucial role in governance. Together, they formed the core of political power. The spread of Christianity required more than royal support. It demanded the creation of an entire religious system. Bishoprics were established, churches built, and clergy appointed across the kingdom. Many of the earliest religious figures came from abroad, bringing with them knowledge and traditions from Western Europe. Gradually, local clergy emerged, and the church became rooted in Hungarian society. This transformation was not without resistance. Pagan beliefs, deeply tied to identity and tradition, did not disappear easily. Revolts broke out, rituals continued in secret, and old customs persisted in daily life. Laws were introduced to enforce new practices, regulating behavior and punishing those who resisted. Over time, these measures succeeded. Paganism faded, leaving only fragments preserved in folklore and language. Some of these ancient beliefs survived in altered forms. Myths about sacred trees connecting different worlds, or ideas about the human soul existing in multiple forms, continued among rural populations. Traditions associated with shamans, figures believed to possess supernatural abilities, also lingered. These elements, though stripped of their original religious meaning, remained part of cultural memory. By the end of the 11th century, Christianity had firmly taken root. The old order had been replaced, and a new system stood in its place. The transformation was profound. It reshaped society, redefined power, and connected Hungary to the wider world of European civilization. The institutions created during this period endured long after the struggles that gave birth to them had faded into memory. By the 12th century, the kingdom established by Stephen I of Hungary and expanded under Ladislaus I of Hungary and Coloman of Hungary had reached a stage of relative stability. Unlike the turbulent era of its foundation, this period appears quieter on the surface. Yet this impression is shaped partly by the nature of surviving evidence. Written records from this century are fewer and less revealing. Legal codes, which could illuminate internal structures, are almost entirely absent. Instead, knowledge comes from scattered documents and the observations of foreign visitors. Among them were a learned Arab geographer, a German bishop who travelled with crusaders, and a Muslim traveller from the Western Mediterranean. Their accounts, based on direct or indirect experience, offer rare glimpses into a kingdom that otherwise remains partially hidden. After the death of Coloman, power passed to his son, Stephen II, who ascended the throne at a young age. His reign was marked by constant warfare. Year after year, he launched campaigns into neighbouring lands, yet without a clear long-term direction. These expeditions brought little success. Defeats, retreats, and lost territories followed one another. Dalmatia briefly returned to Hungarian control, only to be lost again. Conflicts with the Byzantine Empire escalated, drawing the kingdom into a cycle of attack and retaliation. At the same time, it became evident that Stephen would leave no direct heir. In response, attention turned to a relative who had once been cast aside. Bela, blinded as a child and hidden away, was brought back into political life, married into a foreign dynasty, and prepared for succession. Shortly after, Stephen's reign came to an end. Bela II formally took the crown, but real authority lay elsewhere. His wife, Helena, emerged as the dominant force behind the throne. Her rule began with a brutal purge of those she blamed for past injustices. Leading figures associated with earlier regimes were eliminated in a single violent act. Opposition quickly gathered around a rival claimant, a figure connected to the royal family but raised abroad. With foreign backing, he attempted to seize power. Though defeated, he remained a persistent threat for years, appearing again and again in political struggles. Despite internal tensions, the kingdom continued to expand its claims. Military expeditions reached into regions to the south, including Bosnia. Although no lasting territorial control was secured, titles were adopted that suggested authority over these lands. These claims would endure long after their original meaning had faded, becoming part of the royal identity. Following Bela's death, the throne passed to his son, Gaza II, who ruled during a time of growing international complexity. His reign was dominated by shifting alliances and constant military engagement. Hungary found itself positioned between two powerful empires, each seeking influence. Instead of retreating, Gaza pursued an active foreign policy. Armies were sent eastward to intervene in the affairs of distant principalities. Campaigns against Byzantium continued, sometimes in alliance with neighbouring rulers. Although not always successful, these actions demonstrated confidence rather than weakness. Observers of the time described Hungary as a formidable power. Its ruler commanded loyalty from his nobles, and its military strength impressed outsiders. Yet beneath this strength, internal divisions began to emerge. Rival factions within the elite challenged royal authority, sometimes aligning themselves with foreign powers. Members of the royal family themselves became tools in these struggles, seeking external support to claim the throne. Political unity weakened and stability became fragile. After Geza's death, this instability erupted into open conflict. His son, Stephen III, briefly ruled before being forced into exile by relatives supported by Byzantine forces. The throne changed hands rapidly, passing between competing claimants. Religious authority also became entangled in these struggles. One leading church figure refused to recognize certain rulers, leading to further division. Eventually, Stephen regained power, but the kingdom had been deeply shaken. At the center of these events stood a younger prince, Bela, whose fate would shape the future. Sent to the Byzantine court, he was raised and educated within a different political and cultural environment. For a time, he was even considered a potential heir to the imperial throne. His position created the possibility of a union between two great realms. Yet circumstances changed, and that vision never materialized. Instead, Bela returned to Hungary and eventually became king in his own right. His accession was not without difficulty. Suspicion surrounded his upbringing abroad, and not all accepted him immediately. Nevertheless, he secured the throne and proved himself capable. Under his rule, Hungary entered a new phase. The balance of power in the region shifted as Byzantine influence declined. Neighbouring states asserted independence, and new political entities emerged. Bela responded quickly, reclaiming lost territories and launching campaigns into contested regions. His reign marked both the peak of royal authority and the beginning of deeper structural changes within the kingdom. While political events unfolded, the everyday life of the population followed patterns shaped by land and tradition. Visitors consistently remarked on the richness of the land. Vast plains supported enormous herds of animals, and pastures stretched across wide distances. Livestock formed the backbone of the economy. Horses remained especially important, not only for transport and warfare, but also as a symbol of status. Over time, ownership of horses became associated with privilege, distinguishing higher social groups from the rest. Cattle, sheep, and pigs were raised in large numbers. Animals were often kept outdoors throughout the year, watched over by herders. This method of livestock management reflected older traditions and continued for centuries. Fishing also played a major role, with rivers and lakes providing abundant resources. Certain species, particularly large fish from major rivers, were highly valued. Hunting, on the other hand, became increasingly associated with the nobility, though it was not entirely forbidden to common people. Agriculture gradually took on greater importance. The fertile soil produced abundant crops, and observers frequently commented on the ease of life compared to other regions. Grain was plentiful, and famine appears to have been rare. Farming techniques improved over time, influenced by neighbouring populations. New crops, tools, and methods were adopted, transforming agricultural practices. Vineyards spread across the land, and wine became a common part of daily life. Settlement patterns also evolved. By this period, most of the population lived in villages. These communities were often located near water sources, with houses scattered rather than arranged in orderly rows. Buildings were simple, constructed from wood and other readily available materials. Life remained closely tied to the land, and mobility persisted in certain forms, especially where farming required the periodic movement of fields. Some settlements grew larger and more complex, forming early market centres. These were not cities in the later sense, but served as hubs of trade and administration. Regular markets brought together people from surrounding areas, facilitating exchange. Over time, certain locations developed into more permanent centres of economic activity. Migration also played a significant role in shaping the kingdom. Groups from Western Europe moved eastward, settling in various regions. Some established communities near major centres, contributing to economic and cultural development. Others formed larger, more cohesive settlements, preserving their language and traditions. These newcomers introduced new skills and practices, influencing local society in lasting ways. The royal treasury drew income from multiple sources. Coinage was one of the most important, supported by domestic silver production. Mining expanded, providing the raw materials needed for currency. Trade routes connected the kingdom to distant markets, linking it with both eastern and western regions. Goods moved along these routes, though commerce remained limited compared to later periods. Salt, extracted from deposits in the eastern regions, became another valuable resource. Controlled by the crown, it was distributed widely and even used as a form of payment. Other revenues came from tolls, markets, and taxes collected across the kingdom. These diverse sources reflected an iqtisad that was still developing, balancing traditional practices with emerging systems of exchange. Trade itself was shaped by geography. Routes leading toward eastern centres remained especially important, while connections to the west gradually expanded. Luxury goods dominated long-distance exchange, consumed mainly by the elite. Within the kingdom, markets facilitated local trade, though the full extent of internal commerce remains difficult to determine. Specialized groups played a key role in managing trade and finance. Merchants and administrators from distant regions brought expertise that supported the functioning of the economy. Their presence highlights the openness of the kingdom to external influences, even as it maintained its own traditions. Understanding the social order of early medieval Hungary is far from straightforward. The structure that existed before the 13th century was fundamentally different from what later emerged, and much of its true nature remains difficult to define. The transformation that took place between the years 1200 and 1350 reshaped society so completely that earlier forms became almost unrecognizable. What came afterward is relatively clear, but the older system is harder to grasp, especially because the meaning of key concepts such as freedom and servitude changed over time. In later medieval Hungary, freedom was closely tied to mobility. A person who could choose a lord freely and move without restriction was considered truly free. This form of liberty belonged mainly to nobles, townspeople, and a few privileged peasants. Those who were bound to a lord and unable to leave their land were regarded as unfree. Over time, this distinction became the defining line in society. However, applying this later definition to earlier centuries creates serious misunderstandings. In the earlier period, the division between free and unfree people existed, but its meaning was very different. A person described as free in the 11th century did not necessarily enjoy unrestricted movement. Many of them were still tied to obligations that passed from generation to generation. Likewise, servitude did not always mean the same rigid condition that developed later. Language itself reflects this change, as older terms for freedom and servitude disappeared and were replaced by new ones, suggesting that their original meanings had faded. The status of a serf, however, can be described with greater clarity. A serf was treated primarily as property. His life and labour belonged to his master, who could dispose of him much like any other possession. He could be bought or sold, and if he was killed, compensation was paid to his owner rather than to his family. Relationships between free individuals and serfs were strictly controlled, and crossing that boundary could result in the loss of freedom. Despite this harsh reality, serfs were not entirely without recognition. Their actions could be judged according to specific rules, and punishments were directed at them personally. Some were allowed to possess limited goods or manage small holdings, though these were not legally their own. Over time, certain serfs were granted greater autonomy. living with their families and cultivating land while still remaining under the authority of their lord. In rare cases, freedom could be granted, allowing them to enter the ranks of the free. The defining feature of servitude was the absence of legal identity. A serf could not act independently in legal matters and had no formal rights. Whatever he possessed or did remained under the control of his master. In contrast, a free person was recognized as a full member of the community. Freedom was expressed through the ability to participate in legal proceedings, to testify, and to defend one's interests before authority. Yet freedom did not mean independence. Most free people were still bound by obligations that defined their place in society. Warriors were expected to fight, while commoners were required to perform labour. These duties were inherited and shaped by custom. Unlike the unlimited demands placed upon serfs, the obligations of free individuals were fixed and recognised. They might be demanding, but they were not arbitrary. Among the free population there existed a special category of settlers who enjoyed a broader form of liberty. These were newcomers from other regions who settled in the kingdom under specific agreements. They lived according to their own traditions and laws, paid rent for the land they used, and retained the right to leave if they wished. This condition made them distinct from the native population and gradually became a model for later forms of peasant freedom. Within the wider group of free people, clear divisions could be observed. Society was not equal, and difference in status were deeply rooted. Some were considered wealthy and powerful, often associated with military roles, while others were regarded as ordinary. These distinctions were not simply based on wealth, but were inherited. Birth determined one's position, and even minor differences in lineage could define a person's place in the hierarchy. Over time, these groups became closely linked to the system of royal fortresses. Around these centres, communities were organised into distinct categories. One group consisted of warriors attached to the fortress, forming a military elite. The other included the general population living under the authority of the fortress. Both groups were bound to their roles, yet they retained their status as free individuals. The people living in these communities worked the land and supported the administrative and military structure. Their obligations included providing food and supplies to officials and troops. This service was considered a normal duty rather than a mark of inferiority. Meanwhile, the warriors held a higher position. They owned land, served in the army, and exercised authority over others. Their role combined privilege with obligation, as they were expected to defend the realm whenever required. Military organisation relied heavily on these fortress-based groups. Each fortress contributed its own contingent of fighters, forming the backbone of the army. Alongside them were individuals drawn from the broader population, selected and equipped for service. This system allowed the kingdom to mobilise significant forces when needed, even without a large standing army. The administrative structure extended beyond the fortress itself. The surrounding territory was divided into districts governed by officials who represented royal authority. These officials held considerable power, commanding troops, collecting revenues and maintaining order. Their position was not inherited but granted by the ruler, and it could be withdrawn at any time. Their authority combined administrative, judicial, and military responsibilities. At the edges of the kingdom, special arrangements ensured defence. Frontier zones were protected by barriers and guarded by specialised groups. These defenders, often skilled mounted archers, monitored movement and provided early warning of threats. The system created a layered defence that combined natural obstacles with human vigilance. Between the clearly free and the fully unfree stood intermediate groups, whose status was more complex. One such group occupied a position that blended elements of both freedom and servitude. They were subject to obligations but retained certain rights. They could be judged under the same rules as free individuals, yet their testimony was not always accepted. Their origin likely lay in populations that had been absorbed into the kingdom and placed under royal authority. These intermediate groups lived in organised communities, much like other peasants, and their duties were clearly defined. Some provided military service, while others fulfilled economic roles. Their obligations were fixed, and their position, though limited, offered a degree of stability. Another category included people defined by specific services. Entire villages might be associated with particular tasks, such as crafting tools, managing livestock, or producing goods. These roles were inherited and shaped the identity of each community. Despite their specialized duties, these people remained primarily agricultural workers, supporting themselves through farming while fulfilling their assigned functions. The status of these groups varied widely. Some enjoyed respect due to the importance of their work, while others were viewed as lower in rank. What united them was the fixed nature of their obligations. Each group knew its role, and these roles formed an essential part of the broader social system. Over time, many of these distinctions began to fade. As society transformed, older categories disappeared or merged into new ones. Yet traces of this earlier structure survived, revealing a world where status was determined by birth, obligation, and tradition. It was a system that balanced hierarchy with stability, shaping the lives of all who lived within it. Private ownership did not suddenly appear with the rise of the Christian kingdom. Some form of it must have already existed in earlier times, although its exact shape remains unclear. By the age of Stephen, however, the situation had changed noticeably. Villages had clearly defined borders, and different social groups lived within them under established conditions. Powerful families controlled wide stretches of land and pasture, necessary to sustain their herds and retainers. At the same time, a new kind of authority began to emerge, one that would later resemble what is known as lordship. This development became visible when land, along with the people living on it, was granted to churches and other institutions. This form of control differed from the authority exercised by royal officials. A landholder possessed direct power over his estate, and everything attached to it. Property could be inherited, divided, or transferred according to the will of its owner. Land could pass to children, relatives, or religious foundations, and once granted, it was expected to remain in the hands of the new holder. This created a system in which ownership was no longer tied only to the crown, but also to individuals and institutions. Religious institutions played a crucial role in shaping this new order. Because they insisted on recording their rights, much of what is known about early landholding comes from them. Monasteries and bishoprics received entire villages, sometimes with detailed descriptions of their boundaries. Many place names still reflect these early donations, preserving the memory of lands once belonging to bishops or abbots. One of the clearest examples comes from a large estate granted to a monastery in the early 11th century. The population living there was organised into many specialised groups, each defined by its duties. Some cultivated vines, others farmed the land, fished in rivers, or worked as craftsmen. There were also individuals who paid their obligations in raw materials, rather than labour. Alongside them stood a group of armed men responsible for defending the estate and escorting its leaders when required. Additional workers provided transport and logistical support, often using horses and carts. This arrangement reveals a society structured around function and obligation. A significant portion of the population consisted of ordinary free peasants, while others occupied intermediate positions between freedom and servitude. Armed retainers formed a smaller but important group, reflecting the need for defence and order. Notably, fully dependent serfs were not always present in such communities, as many inhabitants retained defined rights and responsibilities. At this stage, transferring land did not immediately strip its inhabitants of their status. Those who lived on the land continued to follow established customs, and their duties remained largely unchanged. What changed was the authority above them. Instead of answering directly to the king, they now served a new lord. Their rights were still recognised, but the shift in power altered the balance of society in subtle yet significant ways. For many, this transition was deeply unsettling. Communities that had once considered themselves tied only to royal authority suddenly found themselves under the control of private lords. Although their obligations were not immediately increased, their position felt less secure. Some chose to leave rather than accept the new arrangement, leading to widespread movement across the kingdom. These displaced individuals created instability, forcing the authorities to intervene and restore order. The rise of private landholding also brought tension over property and ownership. Protecting property became a central concern, and harsh measures were introduced to defend it. Theft, once punishable by fines, now led to severe penalties. Punishments could include mutilation or death, depending on the severity of the crime. Even minor offences were treated with extreme seriousness, reflecting the importance placed on maintaining order in a rapidly changing society. Over time, these harsh measures began to soften. Later, rulers reduced the severity of punishments and introduced more structured legal procedures. The period of crisis gradually passed, and the system of property and authority stabilized. As this happened, older ideas about freedom and dependence began to change as well. A new understanding of freedom slowly took shape. True freedom came to be associated with independence and mobility. Those who could move freely and choose their allegiance were considered genuinely free. Others, even if they held respected positions, were increasingly seen as bound by their obligations. Service, whether military or agricultural, became a sign of dependence if it was permanent and inherited. This shift marked a turning point in social thinking. Earlier distinctions had been based on tradition and role, but now they were defined by personal autonomy. Freedom was no longer simply a matter of status, but of independence. Anyone tied to a fixed duty, no matter how prestigious, was seen as lacking this higher form of liberty. At the same time, not all land in the kingdom followed the same pattern. The territories connected to royal strongholds formed a distinct category. These lands were not treated as private estates in the usual sense. The people living there retained certain rights, including participation in legal matters and military service. Their connection to the crown remained different from the relationship between a lord and his dependents. Beyond these areas lay the extensive lands directly controlled by the royal family. These territories were vast and varied, including pastures, villages, and large forested regions. They were managed through local centres and supported the needs of the court. Some areas were reserved for specific purposes, such as maintaining herds or supplying resources. Forests held particular importance. They were not simply wild land, but carefully controlled regions that included both natural resources and the people who lived within them. These areas were protected and managed by officials responsible for maintaining order and overseeing their use. The scale of these lands demonstrates the wealth and reach of royal authority during this period. Religious estates continued to expand, supported by both rulers and nobles. New religious communities were established, bringing fresh influences and connections. Some of these institutions became major landholders, shaping the economic and social landscape around them. Their growth reflected the increasing integration of the kingdom into broader European developments. The lands of the nobility are less well documented, but it is clear that powerful families controlled large estates. These holdings served as both residences and centres of authority. Within them lived households composed mainly of dependent workers, who cultivated the land and produced goods. The lord exercised extensive control over these communities, which functioned as self-contained units. Such estates formed the foundation of aristocratic power. They provided resources, manpower, and status, allowing their owners to maintain influence within the kingdom. The household itself included not only the family, but also servants and labourers, all bound together under the authority of the landowner. By the opening years of the 13th century, the darkness that covers the earlier story of Hungary begins to lift with surprising speed. Around 1200, the surviving evidence suddenly becomes far richer than before. Earlier centuries had left behind only a thin scattering of written records. But now, charters multiplied rapidly until they were being issued in vast numbers each year. For the period before 1300 alone, thousands of documents survive. At the same time, Hungary's connection with Rome entered a new phase. During the age of Innocent III, the papacy followed the affairs of the Hungarian kingdom, with unusual attention and at times intervened directly. Because of this, correspondence between the Pope and the Hungarian crown became one of the clearest windows into both the kingdom's foreign ambitions and its domestic struggles. The central transformation of this age was the rise of the Hungarian nobility as a distinct social body and, even more importantly, as an organised political force. Yet this nobility was not the same as the noble class found in much of Western Europe. In many lands, nobles traced their identity to knightly birth, great inherited wealth, and a social world shaped by chivalric ideals. In Hungary, however, noble standing rested above all on ownership of free landed property. A man was noble because he held land as his own possession, not because he belonged to a mounted warrior aristocracy in the Western sense. This created a remarkably broad noble class. Many people who elsewhere might have been counted among peasants were in Hungary treated as nobles, because they lived on their own allodial land rather than working the estate of another lord. At the lower end of this broad noble world stood people who still owed inherited service to a superior lord. By the early 13th century, the old line between freemen and serfs had lost much of its clarity, and another distinction took its place. Society increasingly separated those who lived by peasant labour from those whose traditional role was military service. This became one of the major tests of noble standing in the widest sense. Those who had long served in war or had supervised large estates drifted away from the mass of ordinary cultivators. Among them were castle warriors, freemen attached to lordly households, and military dependents of major church estates. These groups were treated as noble in a broad sense, yet they did not enjoy the same liberties as the true nobles of the realm. Some of these half-noble communities survived for centuries. The true political nobility of Hungary emerged from several different social roots. Many came from those known as the king's servants during the reign of Andrew II. Others rose from the ranks of castle warriors, or even from peasant background after receiving land and noble status by royal charter. At the top stood ancient kindreds that claimed descent from famous forefathers of the kingdom's earliest age. Though their origins differed widely, these groups gradually fused into a more unified class during the 13th century. What bound them together was not a shared lifestyle, but a set of common liberties, expressed most famously in the Golden Bull of 1222. Among the most numerous of these early nobles were the king's servants. In some counties they appear in remarkable numbers, holding villages wholly or partly in their own hands. Their position resembled that of warriors, who served the ruler directly rather than a local bishop or count. Some had clearly received their lands from royal favour, especially from the middle of the 12th century onward, and such grants became increasingly common after 1200. A recipient might be a foreign guest, a native Hungarian raised up from unfree status. or a man from an older warrior family whose ancestors had held land since the earliest Christian kings. By entering the king's service and holding land directly from the crown, such men formed the backbone of the rising lesser nobility. Yet the word noble had once meant something narrower. Originally, it referred above all to those born from ancient noble kindreds, families that traced their male line back to the leading men of the 11th and 12th centuries. By the late 13th century, a chronicler counted more than 100 such kindreds. Whether the exact number was accurate matters less than the fact that a recognizable group of old-born lineages still stood apart from the wider noble world. Around 1300, these families remained distinguished by wealth, prestige, and ancestral memory. Many claimed descent from pre-Christian chiefs or heroic figures linked to the conquest of the Carpathian Basin. Even poorer kindreds could preserve great pride in such origins, while richer ones often had less need to advertise them. The memory of descent mattered deeply. Families identified themselves by the name of a famous ancestor, even when the exact chain of generations was unclear. Some noblemen proudly described themselves as belonging to the lineage of a celebrated forefather, simply to mark their elevated birth. In fact, the weaker or poorer a branch became, the more useful this ancestral identity could be. For men sinking into obscurity among the lesser nobility, noble lineage was a shield against being lost in the crowd. This attachment to ancestral prestige remained powerful well into the late 13th century. Families descended from foreign settlers, even when successful and influential, could still be marked out as newcomers. Some of these immigrant lineages became among the greatest in the kingdom, yet memory of their outside origin remained alive. In this way, noble society in Hungary balanced two forces at once: deep pride in ancient native descent and a steady absorption of outsiders who rose by royal service and landed wealth. Heraldry helped strengthen that identity. As foreign knightly customs spread into Hungary, the outward signs of chivalric culture also became attractive. Names from popular romances appeared among the elite for a time, and coats of arms became fashionable. The royal court led the way, adopting symbols that later came to define the kingdom and dynasty. Noble families followed this example, often transforming an older family emblem into a formal coat of arms. Over time, related branches could still be recognized by similar symbols on their seals and shields. In some cases, these emblems preserved memories reaching back to the 11th century or earlier. Heraldry did not create noble identity, but it gave visual form to claims of descent and continuity. Even so, membership in a kindred did not mean that property remained communal. Since the age of St. Stephen, land in Hungary was inherited by equal division among sons. Estates were split branch by branch, generation after generation, and each line then lived independently. Only monasteries founded by the family tended to preserve a lingering form of collective association. This pattern of equal inheritance steadily broke great fortunes into smaller pieces. Some once prominent kindreds fragmented into modest, landed families that drifted into the lesser nobility. In later centuries, a family that eventually rose to great fame might have begun as one tiny offshoot of a once larger lineage. The system preserved freedom, but it also ensured constant division. Around 1200, one writer gave voice to the ideals of these old noble families. Though a cleric, he filled his narrative with admiration for the pagan conquerors of the land and argued, in effect, that Hungary ought to be governed by their descendants. His picture of the past turned the conquering leaders into founders of hereditary right, as if rule over counties and high offices should naturally belong to their bloodlines. Yet the leading barons of his own day were largely absent from his story. Perhaps for that reason his work had little immediate influence, but the spirit behind it endured. It expressed an aristocratic vision of Hungarian history that would echo for generations. When Emmerich came to the throne in the late 12th century, Hungary's foreign policy took a new turn. For the first time, a Hungarian king pursued an active and sustained interest in the Balkans. This shift was closely tied to the ambitions of the papacy, which sought not only to guide, but also to expand Latin Christianity. Hungary stood on the frontier between the Latin world and neighbouring peoples viewed from Rome as pagans, schismatics, or heretics. That position gave the kingdom new importance. In the south and east lay Serbia, Bulgaria, Bosnia, and the lands of the Cumans. Against them, Hungary could present itself as a defender and extension of the Roman Church. From this point onward, Hungarian expansion and papal policy often moved together. Emmerich involved himself in Serbian dynastic struggles by backing one claimant against another, but his intervention brought no lasting result. Serbia remained independent and would continue to challenge Hungarian influence for generations. Even so, Hungarian kings adopted the royal title connected with Serbia and kept it long afterward. Bulgaria, meanwhile, was growing stronger under its own rulers and established direct ties with Rome, frustrating Hungarian hopes of dominance there. Bosnia, weaker than its neighbours, offered more room for Hungarian influence. By the early 13th century, Hungary was already pressing its authority there, especially under the excuse of suppressing heresy. Then came the great shock of 1204, when the Fourth Crusade captured Constantinople. For Hungary, the most painful event connected with that crusade was the attack on Zadar, a city under Hungarian rule. Despite papal protests, the damage could not be undone. Not long after, Emmerich died, leaving a young son and a dangerous political situation. His brother Andrew became regent, but almost immediately behaved as if the crown were already his. The widowed queen fled with her child, and when the boy soon died, Andrew took the throne for himself. Andrew II gave Hungarian foreign policy a different direction. He launched repeated campaigns toward Galicia, becoming deeply involved in the struggles of the Russian principalities. Sometimes he acted as a protector, sometimes as a kingmaker, and at one stage he even tried to secure the region for his own sons. Though these efforts brought temporary success, they never produced stable Hungarian control. In time, Galicia slipped from Hungary's grasp. At the same time, a new eastern frontier began to attract attention. Beyond the Carpathians lay the lands known as Cumania, inhabited by Turkic nomads whose territory stretched across the steppe. Andrew saw the possibility of expanding Hungarian influence in that direction. To support both defence and missionary work, he settled the Teutonic Knights in the southeastern borderlands of Transylvania. They were expected to defend the frontier, convert the Cumans, and take possession of lands beyond the mountains in the king's name. The knights worked with energy, building strongholds and settlements, but soon their ambitions outran what the Hungarian king would tolerate. When they began looking to the Pope rather than the Hungarian crown for protection, Andrew acted decisively and expelled them. Yet the greatest struggles of Andrew's reign were not on the frontier but inside the kingdom itself. One major source of tension was the influence of foreigners at court. His first queen, Gertrude, surrounded herself with Germans and advanced their interests aggressively. Her relatives and favourites gained offices and wealth on a scale that deeply angered the Hungarian elite. Resentment boiled over in 1213 when she and members of her entourage were murdered while the king was away. The king could punish only a few, which revealed how limited his support had become among the great men of the realm. Andrew was also pressured for years to fulfill a crusading vow connected with the Holy Land. After long delay, he finally departed in 1217 with a substantial force, becoming the only Hungarian ruler ever to lead such an expedition. Militarily, it achieved very little. The campaign lacked decisive leadership, and Andrew soon headed home. Still, the journey allowed him to build diplomatic ties with rulers across the eastern Mediterranean and the Balkans, arranging marriages that would shape Hungary's international connections. More important than any campaign abroad was the domestic policy Andrew introduced soon after becoming king. He called it a new system, but its heart was simple. He distributed enormous quantities of land to his supporters. Royal grants were not unknown before, yet the scale now became unprecedented. Vast estates were handed over permanently, and not only empty forest or frontier land. Settled lands, including those tied to the old castle system, were also given away. Andrew boasted openly that the finest grant was one without measure. In practice, this policy created new magnates almost overnight. Some of the great landed fortunes of later medieval Hungary began in these years. These grants enriched the realm's leading office holders and strengthened the emerging baronial class. During Andrew's reign, the term baron came into regular use for the highest dignitaries of the kingdom. These men stood at the top of royal government, holding the greatest judicial, military and household offices. Their careers depended on royal favour, yet custom required the king to choose them from the most distinguished noble families. Around them, the machinery of high office became clearer, more structured, and more visible than before. Andrew's policy may have been meant to strengthen the army by rewarding mounted service, but the estates he granted were not held as true feudal fiefs in the Western sense. They were hereditary possessions, given not in exchange for future obligations carefully written into law, but as permanent rewards for services already performed. Royal charters celebrated the deeds of the recipient in long, often vivid narratives. These documents now offer some of the richest evidence for the politics of the age. But whatever Andrew's intentions, the consequences were explosive. By weakening the old castle organisation and enriching a select few, he disturbed the social balance of the kingdom and provoked widespread anger. The backlash came soon after. Before leaving on crusade, Andrew had appointed the Archbishop of Esztergom to govern in his absence, hoping perhaps to calm opposition. Instead, on his return, he found a kingdom exhausted by debt, conflict, and administrative disorder. Military preparation and royal extravagance had strained the treasury, and extraordinary taxation added fresh resentment to older grievances. His own son, Bela, began to drift toward opposition. In 1222, the crisis broke into open political action. A great assembly forced the king to dismiss his leading men and accept a charter of liberties that became famous as the Golden Bull. The document claimed to restore ancient rights and correct abuses that had poisoned relations between ruler and subjects. Much of it was aimed directly against recent royal practices. It tried to limit excessive grants, restrain foreign influence, and check arbitrary government. But its deepest significance lay elsewhere. It set down clearly, for the first time, the liberties of the nobles. The charter declared that nobles were free from taxation and burdens, such as forced lodging. It limited their military obligations and protected them from ordinary county jurisdiction. They could not be arrested without lawful process, and only the highest royal authorities could judge their cases. These measures separated them sharply from other armed groups in the kingdom, who still owed broad service to lords or ecclesiastical estates. In effect, the Golden Bull gave legal form to the political identity of the Hungarian nobility. Its most famous clause went even further. If a king violated the charter, the bishops, barons, and nobles were declared entitled to resist without being treated as traitors. In later centuries, this would gain enormous symbolic force. though in the medieval period it was invoked far less often than later legend suggested. The real importance of the Golden Bull lay not in immediate revolution, but in the durable language it gave to noble liberty. The document has often been compared to Magna Carta, but the two emerged from very different worlds. The Hungarian movement was not driven by bishops or shaped by the same constitutional tensions found in England. It came mainly from lay opposition to recent royal policy, especially the redistribution of land and power. Still, the charter outlived the immediate moment of its birth. Though its original copies vanished, its principles were renewed later and eventually became one of the great foundations of the Hungarian noble order. In the final years of Andrew's reign, power increasingly shifted toward his sons, especially Bela. As ruler of Transylvania, Bela pressed Hungarian influence toward the south and east, often with the backing of the Dominican order. The Cumans, under rising pressure from the Mongols, became more willing to negotiate. Some submitted, accepted Christianity, and entered Hungary's orbit. Missionary bishoprics were founded in the east, and Hungarian rule briefly pushed into regions beyond the lower Danube. Bela even adopted the title King of Cumania, a sign of growing ambition just before disaster struck. His brother Coloman supported similar expansion in the south, especially in Bosnia, where church missions and military action worked together. The church itself was now becoming a stronger political force inside Hungary. It opposed the role of non-Christians in royal finance and resisted fiscal policies that threatened ecclesiastical income. In 1231, another Golden Bull was issued, reaffirming noble liberties while strengthening the rights of the church. When Andrew ignored its terms, the archbishop moved against him with spiritual penalties, forcing a tense settlement under papal pressure. The result was a major agreement that confirmed church privileges, restricted the role of Jews and Muslims in finance, and settled disputes over royal monopolies and revenues. At the same time, new religious orders from the West were reshaping the kingdom's spiritual life. The Dominicans and Franciscans spread rapidly, and their influence soon reached the royal family itself. Saints and holy women emerged from the dynasty, giving the court a new aura of piety. This marked a cultural turning point. In earlier generations, Hungary had still preserved a visible Eastern flavour, with Muslim communities, Greek monks, and a certain religious diversity. But the age of papal reform and Latin zeal gradually erased much of that older world. Muslim communities faded from the record, Greek monastic life withered, and Western Christian uniformity grew stronger. Andrew died in 1235, and Bela IV took the throne with a determination to reverse much of his father's legacy. He viewed Andrew's great grants as reckless and destructive. Once king, he moved harshly against those he blamed for the disorders of the previous reign, confiscating estates and punishing leading figures. He also tried to restore the authority of the crown to an older and more commanding form. Barons were made to stand in council, symbolic signs of familiarity were stripped away, and grievances were to be submitted in writing for formal review. Most of all, Bela sought to halt the collapse of the old royal estate system and recover lands lost under his father. These measures temporarily reinforced royal power, but they also bred resentment. Some contemporaries believed that the growing tension between king and subjects weakened the kingdom on the eve of catastrophe. It was during these years that a strange and long-forgotten branch of Hungarian history briefly returned. Medieval memory had once preserved the idea that not all Hungarians had entered the Carpathian Basin together. Some, it was said, had been left behind in the east. That story had faded, but Dominican friars searching for these distant kin set out in the 1230s. One of them, Julian, eventually found a Hungarian-speaking people far to the east, near the Volga. His discovery was extraordinary, but even more alarming was what he learned there. The Mongol world was moving westward with terrifying force. When a second mission tried to return, it found the region already consumed by invasion. The Eastern Hungarians vanished into that storm. The Mongol advance also drove the Cumans into Hungary in greater numbers. Their leader sought refuge under Béla's protection, promising loyalty and conversion. Béla accepted them, partly because he hoped they could serve as allies against the Mongols and perhaps against his own discontented nobles. But their arrival only sharpened internal tensions. Complaints multiplied over violence, disorder, and the behaviour of the newcomers. The king was accused of favouring them, and distrust spread across the realm just as the real danger approached. That danger became real in 1240, when Kiev fell. In the following spring, Mongol armies moved against Hungary from several directions at once. One force swept through Poland before descending from the north. Another crossed the southern passes. The main army pushed straight through the Carpathians toward the heart of the kingdom. Even then, many in Hungary failed to grasp the scale of the threat. While the royal army gathered near Pest, panic and suspicion turned into violence. The Cumans were accused of collusion with the enemy, and their leader was murdered by a mob. Enraged, his people abandoned the kingdom, ravaging as they withdrew. Even without them, the Hungarian army remained large, and Béla marched east to confront the invaders. The decisive battle came near the Sejo River at Muhi. There, on open ground, the Hungarian forces drew up behind their wagons in a tight defensive camp. The Mongols surrounded them with speed and precision. By dawn, they had crossed the river at multiple points, encircled the Hungarian position, and turned the trapped army into a killing ground. Arrows, confusion, and panic did the rest. It was one of the greatest defeats in medieval Hungarian history. The highest leaders of church and state fell in huge numbers. Béla himself escaped only with difficulty, aided by loyal men who brought him fresh horses as the country collapsed around him. He sought help abroad, but little came. Western rulers were distracted by their own struggles, and some took advantage of Hungary's weakness, rather than assisting it. Meanwhile, the Mongols spread across the country. Towns and settlements burned. Early in 1242 they crossed the frozen Danube, took key centres, and chased the king deep into the southwest. Yet just as suddenly as the storm had arrived, it began to pass. News came that the great Khan had died, and Batu turned back east. The Mongol withdrawal spared Hungary from permanent conquest, but the destruction was immense. Large parts of the kingdom lay devastated, populations had been killed or carried off, and the old order had been shaken to its core. To many observers at the time, it seemed as though the kingdom itself had been destroyed. In the decades that followed the Mongol invasion, Hungary entered a period of profound transformation. The shock of destruction and the pressures of internal change reshaped the kingdom in ways that would define its future. By around 1270, political authority had begun to fracture. Royal power weakened rapidly, and over the following decades this decline deepened into widespread disorder. By the time the Arpad dynasty came to an end in 1301, the kingdom had experienced a long phase of instability. Yet this same period also witnessed sweeping social and economic change, unmatched since the early formation of the state. Older systems of servitude began to break apart. New lands were settled, and new political institutions started to emerge. These developments laid the groundwork for a society in which the nobility would soon act as a unified political estate. The devastation caused by the Mongol invasion remains difficult to comprehend. Entire regions were left in ruin within a single year. Large numbers of people were killed or carried away, and vast stretches of land were left empty. In many areas, survivors wandered through silent landscapes where villages had vanished. Churches stood as lonely markers in abandoned countryside, while fields lay uncultivated. The dead were often left unburied, and disease spread quickly in the aftermath. Hunger soon followed. Within a short time, famine claimed even more lives than the invasion itself. The scale of the demographic loss was immense. Although estimates differ, it is clear that a significant portion of the population disappeared. The impact can be compared to later catastrophes that struck Europe, and its consequences were just as far-reaching. Yet out of this destruction came unexpected change. The crisis accelerated processes that had already begun earlier in the century. Social structures shifted, settlement patterns were transformed, and the kingdom emerged in a new form. The effects of the invasion were not evenly distributed. Western regions suffered less, while the Great Plain experienced near-total devastation. Archaeological evidence shows that many settlements in this region disappeared entirely. In some areas, the ruins of churches stood for centuries as reminders of lost communities. Over time, the lands of abandoned villages were taken over by survivors and used primarily for grazing. This shift laid the foundation for a major expansion in livestock breeding, especially horses and cattle, which would later become a defining feature of the region's economy. At the same time, long-distance trade suffered a severe blow. The earlier disruption of major trade routes had already weakened commercial networks, but the destruction of key eastern centres brought this system to collapse. Regions that had once been economically active quickly lost their importance. Trade routes fell silent, towns declined, and entire areas became increasingly isolated. What had once been dynamic regions of exchange and movement turned into peripheral zones, with limited economic significance. Despite this decline in some areas, other parts of the kingdom began to grow. Western Hungary, with its closer ties to Central and Western Europe, gained importance. New agricultural techniques spread gradually from these regions, improving productivity. At the same time, social conditions among the peasantry began to change dramatically. After the invasion, many peasants abandoned their former lords and moved in search of better conditions. Attempts to control this movement largely failed. Landowners, facing a shortage of labour, were forced to offer improved terms to attract settlers. As a result, a new class of free peasant tenants emerged, enjoying greater independence than before. Population movement during this period was intense. Entire communities relocated, and new settlements appeared in areas that had previously been sparsely inhabited. Royal grants of land encouraged this process, drawing settlers from both within the kingdom and from abroad. These newcomers were often granted favourable conditions, including reduced obligations and personal freedom. Over time, this reshaped the rural landscape and weakened older forms of dependency. Alongside these changes, a deliberate effort was made to strengthen urban life. The rebuilding of the kingdom included the foundation and expansion of towns. Initially, this had a military purpose. Fortified towns were expected to provide defence and support the royal army. However, their economic and social importance soon surpassed their military role. Urban communities developed systems of self-government and became centres of trade and administration. Many of these towns were influenced by models from Western Europe. Settlers, often of German origin, brought with them legal traditions and urban customs. These communities enjoyed privileges that allowed them to govern themselves, elect officials, and regulate their own affairs. They were exempt from certain obligations and instead paid fixed taxes to the crown. This system encouraged growth and stability, and over time, towns became key elements of the kingdom's structure. One of the most significant foundations of this period was the city that would become Buda. Built on a strategic hill above the Danube, it replaced an earlier settlement and quickly grew into a major centre. Its location and fortifications made it both a defensive stronghold and a focal point of political life. Over time, it would become one of the most important cities in the kingdom. In the northern and mountainous regions, similar developments took place. Previously underpopulated areas were settled more densely, often with small landholders who were granted noble privileges in exchange for military service. New villages appeared, and local communities received rights that allowed them to manage their own affairs. This combination of settlement, military obligation, and local autonomy contributed to a more flexible and dynamic society. One of the most important colonization movements occurred in Transylvania, where large numbers of German settlers established communities in strategic locations. These settlements were concentrated in key regions, particularly along important trade routes. Over time, they developed into prosperous towns with strong defensive structures. Their inhabitants enjoyed extensive privileges, including self-government and economic freedoms. These communities played a crucial role in trade and defense, linking the kingdom to wider European networks. At the same time, another distinct group, the Secoli, consolidated their presence in southeastern Transylvania. They formed a unique military society, organized into territorial units, and bound by a shared obligation to serve in war. Unlike other groups, they maintained a high degree of autonomy and preserved older forms of social organization. Their economy was based largely on livestock breeding, and their military role remained central to their identity. They did not pay regular taxes but fulfilled specific obligations to the crown on ceremonial occasions. The origins of the Secoli remain uncertain, but they clearly maintained a strong sense of separate identity. They were integrated into the kingdom while preserving distinct traditions and structures. Their organization reflected an older way of life, one that retained elements of earlier nomadic systems. This made them a unique component of the kingdom's population. Another important population group in Transylvania was the Romanians. Their presence in the region is recorded from an early date, though their origins and the timing of their settlement remain subject of debate. By the later Middle Ages, they formed a significant part of the population, particularly in mountainous and forested regions. Their way of life was closely tied to pastoral activity, especially sheep breeding, and they often moved seasonally between highland and lowland pastures. The Romanians followed the Orthodox faith, which set them apart from the predominantly Catholic population of the kingdom. They were not subject to the same church obligations, but instead paid specific taxes related to their pastoral economy. Their communities were often located in regions that had been settled later, and their presence became more visible over time as population records improved. All these developments took place against the backdrop of political fragmentation. As royal authority weakened, local power grew stronger. Noble families established their own centres of control, often building castles and fortifications that symbolised their independence. The balance of power shifted steadily away from the crown toward regional elites. In response to this instability, new forms of political organisation began to emerge. Assemblies of nobles became more frequent, bringing together representatives of different regions and groups. These gatherings laid the foundation for what would later become the Hungarian Diet, an institution that allowed the nobility to act collectively in political matters. At the same time, local autonomies developed, giving communities greater control over their own affairs. By the end of the 13th century, the outlines of a new political order were becoming clear. The nobility had established itself not only as a social class, but as a political force with defined rights and responsibilities. The changes brought about by war, migration, and economic transformation had reshaped the kingdom. Although the period was marked by instability and conflict, it also prepared the ground for a more structured and participatory system of governance in the centuries that followed. After the middle of the 13th century, a new political awareness began to take shape among the nobles of Hungary. They no longer saw themselves simply as landholders, with privileges, but as a distinct order within society, united by shared rights and interests. This shift became visible in the late 1260s, when a large assembly forced the king and his heir to formally reaffirm the liberties that had already been declared decades earlier. The content of these rights had not changed significantly, but the meaning had. What had once been granted by royal authority was now being claimed collectively by the nobility as something that belonged to them by right. This growing sense of unity soon led to further demands. The nobles no longer wished to remain passive recipients of privilege. They sought a voice in the governance of the kingdom itself. From the late 1270s onward, representatives of the nobility began appearing at national assemblies with increasing frequency. By the end of the century, their presence had become an accepted part of political life. In a remarkable development, their elected delegates were even admitted for a brief period into the Royal Council, an institution that had previously been reserved for the highest churchmen and barons. This marked an early step toward a more participatory political system, one that reflected broader trends across Latin Europe during the same era. The spread of such ideas was not accidental. Educated clerics, many trained in the great centres of legal learning in Italy, brought with them new concepts about law, authority, and representation. At the same time, a parallel process was unfolding at the local level. The roots of noble self-government within the counties can be traced back to the early 13th century. Groups of nobles began to gather independently, organising themselves according to regional boundaries. One of the earliest known examples shows nobles meeting to discuss their affairs collectively, acting as a distinct body within their county. Although records of such assemblies are scarce, it is likely that similar gatherings occurred in many parts of the kingdom. In the decades that followed, this local organisation became more structured. Officials drawn from the ranks of the local nobility were appointed to oversee legal matters and property disputes. Whether these officials represented the beginnings of full self-government or were still extensions of royal authority is debated, but their existence clearly pointed toward a new form of local administration. By the end of the century, the concept of a noble county had taken clearer shape. These counties were governed by elected magistrates from among the nobility, working alongside representatives of the royal administration. This system spread widely, and by the early 14th century, a large number of counties operated under similar arrangements. While these institutional changes were taking place, ideas about the nature of nobility itself were also evolving. A royal cleric, writing in the late 13th century, attempted to explain the origins of Hungarian society in a way that reinforced the position of the noble class. Drawing on older traditions as well as his own interpretations, he presented a vision in which the Hungarian people shared a common ancestry rooted in ancient times. He linked the Hungarians to legendary predecessors and emphasized continuity between past and present. In his narrative, the conquest of the land was not an act of acquisition, but a return to what had always belonged to them. This interpretation was more than a story. It provided a powerful ideological foundation. According to this view, the true Hungarian community consisted only of those who descended from the original conquerors. Others were seen as later additions, either foreigners or descendants of captives. The division between noble and non-noble was explained as the result of ancient laws under which those who failed in their duties were reduced to a lower status. In this way, social hierarchy was presented as something rooted in the distant past, shaped by necessity and tradition, rather than recent change. From this perspective, the nobility was not just a privileged group, but the embodiment of the nation itself. Membership in this community was defined by shared origin, language, and law. This idea would have lasting consequences, shaping political thought for generations. It reinforced the belief that the nobility alone represented the true political body of the kingdom. As these ideas spread, the practical need for written records grew rapidly. Administration became more complex, and disputes over land and rights increased in frequency. The royal chancery expanded its role, producing a growing number of documents that recorded grants, decisions, and official actions. By the mid-13th century, written communication had become essential to governance. Orders were issued in writing, and officials were expected to respond in the same manner, creating a system of record-keeping that strengthened central administration. Legal procedures also became more formalized. Courts relied increasingly on written evidence, and documentation became a central element of justice. This development was supported by a unique institutional network known as places of authentication. These were religious institutions tasked with providing legal services to the population. They recorded agreements, certified documents, and served as witnesses to legal acts. Their role extended beyond simple record-keeping. They were present at property divisions, boundary disputes, and other legal proceedings, ensuring that decisions were properly documented and recognized. Over time, these institutions became indispensable. They provided a reliable framework for legal transactions and helped standardize procedures across the kingdom. Instead of relying on private documents, which could be unreliable, people turned to officially recognized records that carried legal authority. This system reduced the need for independent notaries and created a distinctive approach to legal documentation. As the 13th century drew to a close, Hungary entered a period of severe political crisis. The death of the last ruler of the Arpad dynasty marked the end of a long line of kings and left the kingdom without a clear successor. This moment exposed the fragility of royal authority. In the years leading up to this event, powerful lords had already begun to carve out their own spheres of influence. After the dynasty's extinction, these regional powers expanded further, threatening to divide the kingdom into separate territories. These lords, often described as oligarchs, controlled extensive lands and commanded their own armies. Their authority combined official power with private wealth, making it increasingly difficult for the crown to assert control. Although they still recognized the existence of a king in principle, their actions were largely independent. Each governed his territory as if it were his own domain, exercising judicial and military authority without interference. Their power rested on a network of followers bound by personal loyalty. These retainers, often drawn from the lesser nobility, served their lords in exchange for protection and opportunity. They formed the core of private armies and administrative systems, managing estates, collecting revenues, and enforcing authority. Unlike feudal vassals in other parts of Europe, their relationship with their lord did not involve land tenure. Instead, it was based on personal service, making it more flexible, but also more dependent on individual ties. As these regional powers grew stronger, the balance between central authority and local control shifted dramatically. The kingdom faced the real possibility of fragmentation. Yet even in this period of crisis, the idea of a unified monarchy remained strong. The question was not whether the kingdom should have a king, but who that king should be. Several claimants emerged, each supported by different factions. Among them was a young prince from a powerful European dynasty, whose claim was backed by the papacy. He entered the kingdom with limited support and was crowned under unusual circumstances. However, many of the leading lords rejected this coronation, insisting on traditional conditions that had to be met for a ruler to be considered legitimate. Another candidate was chosen by the barons, a prince with distant ties to the royal line. He was crowned with full ceremony and established himself in the capital, but his authority remained largely symbolic. Real power stayed in the hands of the oligarchs, who controlled the resources of the kingdom. Over time, the balance began to shift. Through a combination of diplomacy, external support, and changing alliances, the first claimant gradually strengthened his position. Rival candidates lost ground, and one by one, key figures in the kingdom began to support him. Even so, his authority remained contested until he was crowned again under the proper conditions, using the traditional symbols of kingship. Only then was his legitimacy widely accepted. With his position secured, the new king faced the immense task of restoring central authority. The oligarchs still held vast territories and operated with considerable independence. Rather than confronting them all at once, he moved carefully, consolidating his support and building alliances. Over time, he began to challenge their power directly. The struggle that followed was long and difficult. The king had limited resources at first, relying on loyal supporters, church backing, and those among the lesser nobility who sought protection from the dominance of local lords. Gradually, he gained strength. Some of his opponents hesitated to unite against him, allowing him to confront them individually. Each victory increased his prestige and attracted new followers. One by one, the great provincial powers were weakened. Some collapsed quickly when faced with royal authority, while others resisted for years. Key battles tested the strength of the monarchy, and although losses were heavy, the king managed to maintain momentum. Strategic alliances, both within and beyond the kingdom, played an important role in his success. The final phase of the conflict came when the strongest remaining opponent died without an heir. His territories quickly fell apart, and royal forces moved in to secure them. With this, the long struggle came to an end. The authority of the crown was restored, and the era of oligarchic dominance was brought to a close. In the years that followed, the king rebuilt the kingdom on new foundations. The old system of fragmented power was replaced by a more centralized structure, supported by loyal officials and a reorganized administration. Internal stability returned, and the monarchy entered a period of renewed strength. With internal order restored, attention turned outward. The king sought to reassert influence in the Balkans, reviving earlier ambitions. Campaigns were launched to recover lost territories and strengthen control over border regions. Some successes were achieved, but resistance remained strong, particularly from neighbouring states that had grown more powerful during Hungary's period of weakness. Efforts to expand influence met with mixed results. Certain regions were brought back under control, while others proved difficult to hold. Conflicts with neighbouring rulers became a regular feature of foreign policy. In some cases, alliances were formed to secure strategic advantages. In others, military campaigns ended in stalemate or defeat. Despite these challenges, the kingdom emerged stronger than it had been for decades. The restoration of central authority allowed the ruler to draw on the full resources of the realm. For the first time in many years, Hungary once again possessed the strength to act as a major power in the region. The long period of crisis had ended, and a new chapter in its history had begun. For a time, the relationship between Charles and his Habsburg relatives remained stable. Their cooperation was visible in the early 1320s, when Hungarian forces supported Frederick in his struggle for power in Germany. In return, the Austrian dukes restored an important frontier city that had been in their possession for years. Yet, this period of mutual assistance did not last. From the late 1320s onward, tensions rose quickly, and what had once been a partnership turned into open hostility. The first serious break came when Charles was forced to reclaim a contested border region through military pressure. The situation worsened further when the Austrian Duke openly supported rebellious Hungarian lords and even accepted their loyalty. This act challenged royal authority directly. Charles responded with force, launching a campaign into Austrian territory, while his commanders pushed deep into the southern regions under Habsburg control. Although peace was eventually negotiated, distrust remained strong on both sides. In the years that followed, Austrian rulers continued to offer refuge to those who resisted the Hungarian crown, ensuring that relations never fully recovered. While conflict defined the western frontier, Charles found more reliable allies in the north. His ties with Poland became one of the cornerstones of his foreign policy. Even in the early years of his reign, when his own position was still uncertain, he offered military support to the future Polish king. This alliance only grew stronger over time as both kingdoms faced common enemies. Hungarian troops were repeatedly sent to assist Poland in its struggles against powerful rivals to the north and east. This political cooperation was reinforced by dynastic marriage. After losing several wives without securing an heir, Charles married a Polish princess. The union proved decisive. It produced several sons and firmly linked the two royal houses. The importance of this connection became clear when the Polish ruler, lacking a direct successor, chose to designate Charles and his descendants as heirs to his throne. This agreement would later reshape the balance of power in Central Europe. Relations with Bohemia were also positive, though more cautious. The ruler of Bohemia had earlier supported Charles during his struggles against powerful internal enemies. Over time, their cooperation deepened, especially as both kingdoms found themselves opposed to Austrian ambitions. Yet maintaining friendship with both Poland and Bohemia was not simple. The two powers were rivals, each claiming rights over contested territories. Navigating this rivalry required careful diplomacy. Charles's greatest success in this area came in the mid-1330s. Through negotiation and persistence, he helped bring the two rivals to an agreement. Their envoys met to resolve long-standing disputes, and later, their rulers gathered in person to confirm the settlement. The meeting was more than symbolic. It marked the formation of a broader alliance that reshaped regional politics. Trade agreements followed, designed to weaken the influence of competing economic centres and redirect commerce along new routes. This diplomatic achievement secured stability in the region and strengthened Hungary's position as a mediator between powerful neighbours. At the same time, Charles pursued ambitions beyond Central Europe. His attention turned to southern Italy, where another branch of his family ruled. Although a different line had been granted the throne, Charles never fully accepted this arrangement. He believed that his own claim, based on senior lineage, remained valid. After years of tension, a compromise was reached. A marriage alliance linked the two branches of the family, raising the possibility that Charles's descendants might one day inherit the southern kingdom as well. This agreement seemed to open the door to a broader dynastic future. After more than 4 decades on the throne, Charles died in the early 1340s. By that time, he had transformed a fractured realm into a stable and powerful kingdom. His funeral was attended by major rulers of the region, a clear sign of the respect he had earned. Yet despite these achievements, his reputation faded quickly. Later generations focused more on the successes of his son, overlooking the foundation that Charles had built through years of conflict and reform. Part of this fading memory can be traced to the way his story was recorded. Contemporary accounts often emphasize dramatic or tragic events, rather than long-term achievements. One such event involved an attempted attack on the royal family by a nobleman who had once served both the king and his enemies. The assault was quickly suppressed, but the punishment that followed was severe. Not only the attacker, but also many of his relatives were subjected to harsh penalties. Entire branches of his family were destroyed or reduced to servitude. The scale of this response left a deep impression and became one of the most widely remembered episodes of the reign. The reasons behind the attack were never fully explained at the time, leading to speculation. A later account suggested that it was driven by a personal grievance involving dishonour within the royal household. Whether true or not, this explanation added a human dimension to an otherwise political narrative and helped ensure that the incident would be remembered long after other events had been forgotten. When Charles came to power, he presented himself not as a break from the past, but as its continuation. He claimed legitimacy through inheritance, emphasizing his connection to earlier rulers. Symbols and traditions reinforced this message. His family's emblem was combined with that of the previous dynasty, creating a visual link between past and present. This emphasis on continuity strengthened his authority and supported the development of a more centralized form of rule. Despite this claim of continuity, his approach to governance marked a clear shift. He reduced the role of large assemblies and concentrated decision-making in his own hands. Instead of relying on traditional gatherings, he governed with the support of a smaller circle of trusted advisors. Laws and privileges were often granted at his discretion, reflecting a more direct and personal form of authority. In theory, the king still ruled with the advice of leading figures from the church and nobility. In practice, their role became more limited. The structure of high office was reshaped, and the number of individuals holding the highest rank was reduced. This created a more controlled and efficient system, where power flowed from the centre rather than being shared widely. Military obligations also changed. Nobles were expected to support the king's campaigns regularly, often at their own expense. Warfare became a constant feature of political life, with campaigns taking place almost every year. These expeditions extended beyond the kingdom's borders, reflecting a more active and ambitious foreign policy. Relations with the church became increasingly strained as royal authority expanded. While the king had relied on church support during his early struggles, he later asserted greater control over ecclesiastical affairs. He influenced appointments, imposed financial demands, and involved church institutions in military campaigns. Complaints from within the church reveal growing frustration, but they had little effect. The balance of power had shifted, and the monarchy held the advantage. At the same time, the internal structure of the ruling elite was transformed. The old aristocracy, weakened by years of conflict, was replaced by a new group of loyal supporters. These men owed their positions entirely to the king and depended on his favour. Their rise marked a fundamental change in the nature of power. Instead of inherited influence, advancement now depended on service and loyalty. Some of these figures came from modest backgrounds and rose through military or administrative roles. Others were foreign knights who had accompanied the king and proved their value in battle. Together, they formed the backbone of a new governing class. Their authority came not from ancient lineage, but from their relationship with the crown. The royal court itself evolved into a more structured institution. A hierarchy of service developed, with clearly defined ranks and responsibilities. Members of the household acted as the king's representatives, carrying out orders, managing affairs, and even conducting diplomatic missions. This system allowed the ruler to extend his presence across the kingdom without being physically present. Alongside these administrative changes, elements of chivalric culture began to appear. Tournaments were held, symbols of knighthood were introduced, and orders of honour were established. These practices reflected broader European influences, though they were adapted to local traditions. Beneath the surface, the society remained rooted in older customs, blending new ideals with established ways of life. the royal residence also took on greater importance. Although the king continued to travel frequently, a central location emerged as the heart of government. Here, the treasury was kept, ceremonies were held, and major decisions were made. Over time, this place developed into a true centre of power, attracting nobles and officials who sought proximity to the ruler. The strength of the monarchy rested heavily on its control of land. By reclaiming territories that had fallen into private hands and redistributing them strategically, the king built a vast domain. This network of estates provided both income and authority, ensuring that royal influence extended across the kingdom. A new legal concept supported this expansion. Land without clear ownership could be claimed by the crown, reinforcing the idea that ultimate authority over territory belonged to the king. This principle allowed for further consolidation, though it also created uncertainty among landholders. The administration of these lands was organised through a system of offices. High-ranking officials governed regions on behalf of the king, controlling castles and collecting revenues. Their authority was temporary and dependent on royal favour, preventing the emergence of new independent powers. This system ensured that control remained firmly in the hands of the monarchy. Financial reforms played a crucial role in strengthening the state. Revenue collection became more organised, with regional centres responsible for managing income and minting coins. Specialists handled these tasks, bringing expertise that improved efficiency. The system covered a wide range of resources, from trade taxes to natural resources. One of the most significant developments was the exploitation of mineral wealth. Rich deposits of gold were discovered, transforming the economy. Mining expanded rapidly and new settlements were established to support the industry. The crown maintained control over production, while allowing limited participation by private landowners. Gold coins were introduced, modelled on successful foreign examples, but adapted to local standards. These coins spread quickly and became a stable currency. The scale of production was remarkable, making the kingdom one of the leading sources of gold in Europe. This wealth strengthened the monarchy and increased its influence in international trade. Other resources also contributed to royal income. Salt production became a major source of revenue, supported by a state monopoly. Trade taxes were reorganised to increase efficiency and expand coverage. Together, these measures created a strong financial foundation that supported both administration and military activity. Louis inherited the throne at a young age, stepping into a kingdom that had already been reshaped by his father's long struggle for control. The transition of power caused no instability. The political structure remained firm, supported by experienced barons who had served the previous ruler with loyalty. The royal treasury was full, the lands were secure, and opposition was minimal. With such a foundation, Louis was able to act with confidence, drawing on the full strength of his realm without facing serious internal resistance. The era of dynastic conflict that had once weakened royal authority had come to an end. Within the ruling family itself, there was little tension. One brother had been raised abroad, while the others remained within the kingdom, each holding titles that reflected prestige rather than real administrative power. Their roles were carefully managed, ensuring that authority remained centralized. Even when younger members of the family were given responsibilities, these rarely translated into independent political influence. Over time, even these limited, autonomous positions were absorbed back into the royal system, reinforcing the unity of the state. Unlike his father, Louis sought to embody a different image of kingship. He was remembered not for caution or calculation, but for boldness and energy. Contemporary descriptions portray him as physically strong, confident, and commanding. His personality stood in contrast to the more reserved and pragmatic approach of the previous generation. He was open, generous, and eager to gain recognition beyond his borders. For him, the pursuit of honour and reputation was inseparable from the exercise of power. War became central to his identity. Campaigning was not simply a necessity of rule, but a personal passion. Almost every year, he led armies into the field, often without clear strategic objectives. The act of warfare itself seemed to satisfy him. He sought glory in action, sometimes placing himself in unnecessary danger. Accounts describe moments where his own commanders had to restrain him, reminding him of the risks expected of a king. Yet this boldness defined his reign, shaping both his successes and his failures. Outside the battlefield, he found similar excitement in the hunt. Vast forests and mountainous regions became his favoured retreats, where he pursued game with the same intensity he brought to war. Hunting was more than leisure. It was a demonstration of courage and control over nature. He invested heavily in residences near these regions, building strongholds and palaces that reflected both his authority and his personal interests. These places became symbols of royal presence even when removed from the political centre. Despite his martial nature, Louis was not indifferent to learning. He showed interest in books, collected manuscripts, and valued knowledge, though not in a scholarly or academic sense. His curiosity extended to subjects such as astrology and history, reflecting the intellectual trends of his time. Under his rule, important works were compiled and preserved, ensuring that earlier traditions were not lost. Art and culture also flourished in his court, blending local traditions with influences from abroad. Early in his reign, his attention turned to southern Italy, where family ties and political ambition intersected. A disputed succession offered an opportunity to claim a distant throne. Negotiations, alliances, and diplomacy failed to secure the desired outcome, leading Louis to pursue a more direct approach. The death of a close relative under suspicious circumstances intensified his determination, transforming a political dispute into a personal mission. His campaign into Italy began with confidence. His army advanced with little resistance, and his opponents fled before him. For a brief moment, it seemed as though his ambition had been realized. He entered the city as a conqueror and assumed royal authority. Yet this success proved fragile. External crises forced him to withdraw, and without his presence, his control quickly collapsed. Attempts to restore his position met with limited success, as local resistance and shifting loyalties undermined his efforts. The failure of this venture revealed the limits of his power. While he could conquer, he could not easily govern distant lands. Cultural differences, political hostility, and logistical challenges made lasting control impossible. Eventually, he abandoned his claims, accepting that his vision of uniting distant realms would not be achieved. During these years, disease swept across Europe, bringing uncertainty and fear. Although the kingdom was affected, the impact was less severe than in many other regions. Losses were felt, particularly among the elite, but the overall structure of society remained intact. The resilience of the population and the relative abundance of resources helped mitigate the effects of the crisis. While his ambitions in Italy faltered, his efforts closer to home proved more successful. In the western and southern regions, he moved to reassert control over territories that had drifted away from royal authority. Campaigns in these areas brought local rulers into submission, often without prolonged resistance. Gradually, these lands were reintegrated into the kingdom, strengthening its unity and extending its reach. Conflict with a powerful maritime republic became inevitable as both sides sought control over key coastal regions. Early encounters brought setbacks, but Louis persisted. Over time, shifting alliances and repeated campaigns turned the tide in his favour. Coastal cities began to reject foreign rule and align themselves with the Hungarian crown. Eventually, a decisive agreement confirmed his authority over the region. marking one of the most enduring achievements of his reign. Control over these territories was not merely symbolic. He ensured that key fortresses were placed under loyal commanders, and that local elites were integrated into the royal system. This approach prevented the re-emergence of independent power centres and secured long-term stability. Expansion into neighbouring regions followed, supported by both military action and strategic marriages. Though not always successful, these efforts extended Hungarian influence deep into the surrounding areas. To the south and east, the political landscape was changing rapidly. Established powers weakened, while new forces emerged. Louis sought to maintain influence by intervening where possible, supporting allies and asserting authority when opportunities arose. In some regions, local rulers accepted his overlordship, though such arrangements were often temporary. Resistance, shifting alliances, and external threats limited his ability to establish lasting control. Defensive measures became increasingly important as new dangers appeared on the horizon. Fortifications were strengthened, strategic routes secured, and border regions reinforced. These efforts reflected a growing awareness that the stability achieved within the kingdom needed to be protected from external challenges. In the north, a different approach prevailed. Cooperation and alliance replaced conflict, particularly with neighbouring kingdoms. Long-standing agreements were maintained and strengthened, creating a network of support that balanced the more aggressive policies pursued elsewhere. These alliances were reinforced through military assistance and shared interests, ensuring stability along key frontiers. A major turning point came when Louis inherited another crown, extending his authority over a vast territory. This union did not merge the two realms into a single entity, but placed them under one ruler. Administration remained separate, and local traditions were respected. Even so, the expansion increased his influence and elevated his status among European rulers. Despite holding this new crown, his primary focus remained on his original kingdom. His presence in the newly acquired land was limited, and governance was entrusted to trusted representatives. This approach maintained order but also revealed where his true priorities lay. His decisions often favoured the interests of his original domain, sometimes creating tension with his new subjects. The question of succession became increasingly urgent as his reign progressed. For many years, the absence of a direct heir created uncertainty. Various arrangements were considered, involving relatives and potential successors. The birth of daughters eventually provided a solution, but it also introduced new challenges. The idea of female succession was not widely accepted, and securing support for this plan required careful negotiation. Marriage alliances became central to this strategy. Potential heirs were linked to powerful families across Europe, ensuring both support and stability. These arrangements were designed not only to secure the future of the dynasty, but also to maintain the balance of power in the region. The outcome would shape the political landscape long after his death. Religious devotion played a significant role in his rule, influenced strongly by his mother. Her presence at court shaped the tone of governance, encouraging a strict and often uncompromising form of faith. Religious institutions received strong support, with new foundations established and existing ones strengthened. Spiritual authority became closely tied to political power. Efforts to expand religious unity extended beyond patronage. Campaigns were launched to convert populations who followed different traditions, often with limited success. These attempts revealed both the determination of the crown and the resistance of local communities. In some regions, conversions were achieved temporarily, but long-term change proved difficult. Policies toward minority groups also reflected this religious intensity. Communities that had long lived within the kingdom faced increasing pressure. Though not always violent, These measures altered their position in society, reducing their rights and reshaping their role within the broader structure of the state. In his final years, illness changed the character of his rule. The energetic warrior who had once led campaigns across distant lands turned inward, focusing more on spiritual matters. Public life gave way to reflection and devotion. Despite this shift, the system he had inherited and maintained remained stable. When he died, he left behind a kingdom that was strong, expansive, and influential. His reign had extended its reach, reinforced its authority, and secured its place among the major powers of the time. Yet the challenges of succession and the complexity of his legacy ensured that the story would not end with him. Once royal authority had been firmly re-established, it remained remarkably stable throughout the reign of Louis the Great. For nearly 3 decades, his rule was defined not by quiet governance, but by a relentless pursuit of expansion and military action. War shaped both his reputation and the structure of his court. Those who surrounded him were not scholars or administrators, but seasoned commanders. Men who had proven themselves in battle and shared his appetite for conquest. Only in his later years, when illness began to weaken him, did this atmosphere change. The king gradually withdrew from active campaigning and turned instead toward a more contemplative and religious life. By then, however, a new and pressing issue had emerged. It had become clear that his successor would be a young girl, and this reality forced the court to confront a problem that could not be solved by force of arms alone. To secure continuity, power had to be reorganized and concentrated more carefully than ever before. The reforms introduced during the final decade of his reign were designed to achieve precisely that, even if they ultimately fell short of their intended goal. During the 14th century, Hungarian society underwent a profound transformation. Older distinctions between social groups faded away, replaced by a simpler and more rigid structure. Categories that had once defined rural life disappeared from records, and even the last traces of slavery vanished. In their place emerged a broad class of dependent peasants who formed the overwhelming majority of the population. These individuals were tied, not to a master in a personal sense, but to the land they cultivated. Their obligations were heavy, yet clearly defined, and they possessed a limited degree of freedom, including the ability to move from one estate to another under certain conditions. This freedom, once a privilege, gradually became the norm across most of the kingdom. At the same time, the noble class also became more unified. Groups that had once been distinct merged into a single category of recognized nobility. Regional differences lost their importance, and a common legal identity replaced earlier divisions. By the middle of the century, all nobles were officially declared to share the same rights, regardless of their origin. This formal recognition completed a process that had been developing for generations. Society now rested on a clear division between those who owned land and those who worked it. Nobles were defined by their possession of estates, while peasants were those who lived on land belonging to others. This distinction was absolute, leaving little room for movement between the two groups. Within the noble class itself, family structures played a central role. Property was often held collectively by extended kin groups, bound together by shared ancestry and mutual obligation. These groups functioned as unified entities, managing their lands and resources together until division became unavoidable. When estates were eventually divided, strict rules ensured that each branch of the family received an equal share. Yet this process also marked the beginning of new divisions, as each branch became a separate entity in its own right. Women occupied a limited position within this system. While they were entitled to a portion of family wealth under certain conditions, measures were gradually introduced to prevent the fragmentation of estates through inheritance. Instead of receiving land, daughters were often compensated with movable wealth, preserving the integrity of family holdings. Marriage arrangements further reinforced male control over property, ensuring that land remained within the established lineage. A small portion of the nobility found its place at court, forming a distinct elite. These individuals enjoyed privileges and opportunities that were entirely out of reach for the majority of nobles living in the provinces. Life at court offered access to royal favour, offices, and the possibility of acquiring land through grants. Over time, this created a growing divide within the noble class. Those at court accumulated wealth and influence, while provincial nobles struggled to maintain their existing holdings. The contrast between these two groups became increasingly sharp, leading to tensions that would shape the political landscape. One of the most significant sources of conflict was the issue of inheritance. Earlier traditions had allowed nobles to dispose of their property with considerable freedom. This changed as the crown asserted greater control over land. New laws restricted the ability of landowners to pass on their estates, ensuring that property without direct heirs would revert to royal hands. At the same time, new forms of royal grants limited inheritance to specific lines of descent, further strengthening the crown's position. These measures allowed the king to reclaim lands and redistribute them, often to the benefit of those closest to him. Another innovation altered the balance of property even further. In certain cases, daughters could be granted the legal status of sons, allowing them to inherit land directly. This practice provided a way to transfer estates outside traditional lines, often benefiting individuals connected to the royal court. While it offered flexibility, it also contributed to the growing frustration of those who felt their ancestral rights were being undermined. The authority of local institutions declined alongside these changes. The county, once an important centre of administration and justice, lost much of its significance. Powers that had traditionally been exercised at the local level were transferred to central authorities. Judicial functions were increasingly handled by royal courts, while local assemblies were replaced by officials acting on behalf of the crown. Even the right to enforce justice within a territory was gradually extended to private landowners, weakening the role of county officials. As a result, the traditional structures of local governance were steadily eroded. For many lesser nobles, these developments created a sense of exclusion and resentment. Opportunities for advancement were limited, and the legal system increasingly favoured those with influence at court. Wealth flowed toward a small group of powerful families, while others saw their fortunes decline. The gap between expectation and reality became a source of tension, reflected in stories that celebrated individuals who rose from obscurity to prominence through strength and determination. Among the elite, however, a different pattern emerged. Certain families succeeded in establishing lasting influence, passing power from one generation to the next. Their rise was often closely tied to military service and loyalty to the crown. These families accumulated vast estates and held key offices, forming a new aristocracy that dominated political life. Their prominence was reinforced by the king's reliance on them for both warfare and governance. Military organization itself reflected the priorities of the age. Armies were raised through a combination of obligations and paid service. Large numbers of men could be summoned when needed, though their effectiveness varied. For more demanding campaigns, especially those conducted abroad, the king relied on professional soldiers and mercenaries. These forces were better trained and equipped, forming the core of the army in critical situations. Maintaining such forces required significant financial resources, but the wealth of the kingdom made this possible for much of Louis's reign. The financial strength of the state was closely linked to its natural resources, particularly its gold production. Control over these resources allowed the crown to pursue policies that increased revenue, even if they had broader economic consequences. Adjustments to the value of gold influenced trade and currency across the region, strengthening the treasury while placing pressure on neighbouring economies. For many years, these measures ensured stability, allowing the king to fund his ambitions without major difficulty. Signs of strain began to appear only toward the end of the reign. Subtle changes in currency value and the need to raise funds through alternative means suggested that the system was under pressure. The exact causes remain uncertain, but it is clear that the financial balance that had supported decades of expansion was beginning to shift. The final years of Louis's rule were marked by a deliberate effort to reorganize the state. As the prospect of a female succession became unavoidable, the court moved to prevent instability. Attention turned toward limiting the power of the great noble families whose growing influence posed a potential threat. Gradually, the old military elite was replaced by individuals chosen for their administrative and professional abilities, rather than their lineage or battlefield achievements. These new figures brought a different approach to governance. They focused on strengthening central authority, improving administration, and preserving royal resources. Unlike their predecessors, they showed little interest in personal enrichment. Their actions suggest a conscious effort to protect the integrity of the state rather than to advance their own fortunes. Institutional reforms accompanied these changes. New offices were created, existing ones reorganized, and the mechanisms of government made more efficient. Authority was redistributed in a way that allowed decisions to be made more quickly and consistently. Legal administration was expanded, with central courts playing a greater role in resolving disputes. Financial management also became more structured, with designated officials responsible for overseeing revenues and expenditures. Urban communities received increased attention during this period. Their privileges were expanded and their autonomy strengthened. Legal systems began to incorporate their own customs, reflecting a recognition of their growing importance within the kingdom. These changes contributed to a more complex and interconnected administrative structure. Underlying all these developments was the gradual rise of professional expertise. A growing number of individuals with specialized skills entered royal service, particularly in law and administration. Their education, often focused on practical knowledge rather than theoretical study, made them valuable in managing the increasingly complex affairs of the state. Written documentation became more widespread, and the use of Latin ensured a common framework for legal and administrative communication. Higher education, however, remained limited. Attempts to establish institutions of advanced learning met with only temporary success. The needs of the state did not yet require a large class of highly trained scholars, and support for such endeavours remained weak. As a result, intellectual life developed unevenly, shaped more by practical necessity than by long-term planning. By the time of Louis's death, the kingdom had been transformed in many ways. Its authority was centralized, its administration more structured, and its social divisions more clearly defined. Yet beneath this stability lay unresolved tensions. The concentration of power, the growing divide within the nobility, and the uncertainty surrounding succession all hinted at challenges that would soon emerge.